Hello, friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. I have been living for 8 years in an old Victorian mansion nestled in the heart of New Orleans' French Quarter, a building that has harbored dark secrets for decades. I know this house is cursed. The evidence is right before my eyes, and especially because Felix, the ghostly cat who perches on my bed every night, has told me over and over again. Last night, as usual, he sat on my bed, fixed me with his large, dull gray eyes, and whispered for what felt like the millionth time. There are things in this house, big and small, things you've never seen and don't want to see. Sometimes Felix appears almost wet, letting droplets of black slimy mucus fall onto my freshly made mattress. By morning, the slime would have vanished, yet I could sense it silently seeping through the worn linens as he murmured softly. Odd as he is, I've grown accustomed to his presence. My parents, Linda and Michael, simply don't believe in ghosts. Of course, they've experienced a few strange happenings themselves. After all, we've lived in this historic mansion for over 15 years, a structure that was ravaged by a devastating hurricane decades ago and painstakingly rebuilt. When the windows are inexplicably frosted on a mild spring morning, they merely shrug and say, "That's odd." Or when furniture inexplicably shifts from one room to another, they comment, "It's just the age of the house." As a child, I told them about Felix, the ghost cat, and the uncanny events, but they laughed it off, insisting I had a wild imagination. I even searched online for someone who might believe me, yet lately the eerie happenings seem to be intensifying. Not because the forces are growing stronger, but because it feels as though more and more beings are moving into our home. A few months back, Felix whispered, "Tonight, someone else will be here. It's going to get crowded." With that, he licked his striking red tongue over his paw and nestled against my feet as if to say, "I'm watching over you." Whether ghost cats ever sleep, I can't say, but that's just how he is. In the early days, the unexplainable in this mansion was manageable. I was terrified of the strange apparitions when I was young, but as the years passed, I learned to live with them. Now, however, a new, oppressive fear has taken root, especially since it feels as though some of these uninvited guests might actually mean me harm. There's a vast difference between shadows dancing along the walls and the light suddenly flickering out, plunging the entire room into an almost tangible darkness. Felix calls these new manifestations guests, and they seem far more menacing than the familiar specters I once accepted. I used to catch fleeting glimpses of a little girl in the bathroom mirror, a ghostly image of someone long gone. Today, when I step into that cramped tiled bathroom and glance at the antique mirror, I'm struck breathless. The room plunges into pitch-black darkness, even though I stand in a pool of light. It's as if someone had flipped a switch, transforming the world behind the glass into an abyss so profound that you could almost reach out and lose yourself within it. That sensation of tumbling into a bottomless void renders me frozen, convinced that once I step in, there's no escape. But that wasn't even the worst part. A few weeks ago, while climbing the creaking staircase, I felt something hard underfoot, like a small piece of marble. When I looked down, nothing was there, yet the sensation lingered. In the days that followed, it seemed as though tiny, hard stones appeared beneath my feet throughout the house. I even put on my house slippers, and my parents grew concerned. "The floor just feels off," I confided, to which they replied, "It's an old house." I then retreated to my room in silence. That very evening, as I prepared for bed, the sensation returned. I felt as though I was stepping on countless tiny pebbles. Bending down to inspect, I discovered something unbelievable. Under the bathroom sink lay a solitary tooth, and when I looked again, there was another. I held those teeth in my trembling hands, clueless about what to do, and flushed them away in a desperate hope they'd simply vanish. The next morning, to my horror, the entire floor was carpeted in innumerable teeth. I had to literally tread over sharp, jagged remnants. By the time I reached the hallway, my feet were bleeding. Clad in my slippers, I trudged over the painful trail while my parents in the kitchen reacted with puzzled silence. "You have to see this. This isn't normal," I cried out. But my mother, barefoot and surrounded by hundreds of teeth, looked at me bewildered. "What am I supposed to see?" she asked, while my father muttered, "Please, not too loud." And that was the end of our conversation that day. A few days later, as suddenly as they had appeared, the teeth vanished. I had left a bloody trail from my bed to the front door, and my feet remained marked with cuts and bruises. One stubborn tooth even got lodged in my foot, and I painfully tried to extract it with an old pair of tweezers, while Felix sat pensively on the bathroom sink. "That doesn't feel right," he mumbled. "Of course it doesn't," I snapped, finally freeing my foot. I once heard of a man who grew a tooth from his knee. "Strange, huh?" he remarked with a wry smirk. "Where would you even know that from?" I asked, but Felix leaped off the sink and silently vanished into my room. A few nights later, a new guest made itself known. In my doorway stood a towering, shadowy figure, a massive silhouette leaning against the wall. With a deep, eerie whistle, it began a melody that echoed through the mansion's time-worn halls. I had seen odd shadows in my room before, but this one lingered throughout the night, unmoving. At around 3 a.m, the stranger began to sing. His voice was a constant, low hum in my ears, a sound that seemed to come from neither my mind nor any device nearby. You'd want to shake it off, but the hum persisted. 3 crows sat on a fence, sat on a fence, sat on a fence. 3 crows sat on a fence on a cold, frosty morning, he intoned, until the first weak rays of sunlight crept through the stained glass window. "Will he return tonight?" I asked Felix as I reluctantly prepared for the day. "I can't stay awake forever. I'm exhausted." "Maybe," he answered evasively. "That's not a clear answer," I pressed. "It's an old Scottish folk song, you know," he explained. "You mean the song he just sang?" "It seems a well-traveled guest has joined us," he said, which only deepened my unease. And so the spectral routine continued. As always, Felix had perched on my bed the previous night. "In this house, there are countless things, you know," he whispered. "I know," I replied, as Felix curled up in my lap. I stroked his icy fur and listened to his soft purr, as his big gray eyes slowly closed. "I wanted to share all these experiences with you because I believe there are those who understand and believe. And because last night Felix said something that, after so long, made me feel that perhaps everything could eventually return to its familiar, if strange, rhythm." I lay in bed, listening to the quiet sobbing of a little boy from the attic and the mysterious sounds coming from beneath my bed. "You call these apparitions guests, right? The new ones that have moved into our house?" I asked. "Yes," Felix replied. "But guests aren't here forever, are they?" "All guests eventually vanish, even the unwelcome ones," he assured me, before drifting off to sleep. Or at least pretending to, as only ghosts can. Another evening, I gathered my courage and confronted my mother about the bizarre events. I approached her in our small rustic kitchen, where Linda was busy filling a mason jar with pecans and dried fruits, a familiar sight in our modest yet time-honored home. "Mom, remember that morning when all the fruits and nuts ended up in the wrong jars? Everything was mixed up. Wasn't that odd?" I asked. She murmured, not really listening. "Don't you think that's strange? Who could have done that?" "I don't know, sweetheart," she replied indifferently. "Exactly. We don't know. But you can't just ignore it. We've lived here since I was 2, and every day something inexplicable happens. Mom, my earliest memory is of Felix." "Ah, you mean Felix, our old cat? I thought you'd forgotten. He was so sweet to you," she said, pulling me into a brief hug. "Felix?" "Yes, our cat. He was with us for nearly 19 years and passed away shortly after we moved into this house. He always lay by your side from the very first day we brought you here. I bet I still have some old photos of you two. You had such a special bond." "Felix, our cat who always watched over me," I whispered. "He was old when we moved in. One night he slipped out quietly, as if he knew his time had come. Your father found him and brought him back, and just an hour later he closed his eyes for the last time in his arms. We miss him dearly, but he lived a full life and got to know you," my mother concluded, returning to her kitchen tasks. "Was there anything else bothering you, Mom?" I asked. No," she replied hesitantly, and I retreated to the living room. There, Felix had comfortably settled on the old couch, his tail swaying in a gentle rhythm. "Hey, Felix," I greeted softly. "Shut up," he grumbled. "How are you, Felix?" "Screw that," he muttered, turning away. "Don't you like the name?" I queried. "That's not my name anymore. I'm dead," he answered dryly. That night, lying in bed, I felt a strange comfort. Memories of Felix and the old tales made it seem as if he had always been my guardian. Many of you may have suspected from my earlier accounts that Felix, in a way, is here for me. Now, knowing he once was our beloved cat who protected us in life, everything began to make a grim kind of sense. Felix is here to protect me. I was admittedly a bit irritated that my mother brushed off my further questions with a tired smile, as if the haunting events were merely part of our everyday life. Yet, deep inside, a profound unease stirred. Felix leaped back onto my bed and blinked at me with those enormous eyes. "Hey," I said. "Hey," he replied. "Felix, that name doesn't really suit a ghost cat," I mused. "No, it doesn't, but back then I didn't know any better and I didn't care," he retorted. "You know so much more now that you're dead?" I almost asked. "Everyone knows more after death. Don't be so mysterious. Everyone online says you're a jerk." "As if I care. I've got more important tasks, like protecting you from the new guests," Felix declared firmly, before knocking my book off the desk and settling back onto my bed, feigning sleep. Then, as if readying himself for a long confession, Felix began to tell me a story. "When I died, I found myself in a torrential downpour. I set off on a long, arduous journey back to this house. It wasn't easy, but there was always a narrow path guiding me. A little girl, the one you sometimes glimpse in the bathroom mirror, helped me along part of the way, carrying me for a while. But she grew tired and left me alone. The path stretched on, seemingly endless. Then, a being with 10 arms and long, bony fingers appeared and lifted me up, carrying me for a stretch. It said it had to move on, and so I continued. The rain never ceased. Numerous figures came and helped me find my way home. Some explained the meaning of living and dying. Finally, as I caught sight of the dim light on the front porch, a man in a worn brown coat, the very same man you once saw as a little boy peeking out from your old closet, approached me and asked if I truly wished to return. He paused as the soft sobbing of a little boy from the attic echoed faintly. We listened until the crying subsided. "Did he ask if you wanted to come back as a ghost cat?" I asked. "Yes." He nearly held me at the doorstep, explaining that it was a grave decision. If I returned, I'd have an important duty: to protect someone from the new, dangerous guests so they could leave this house alive. He said I had important tasks to fulfill. Then I stepped onto the porch. "Wait, Felix, you can't just drop a prophecy on me like it's nothing." "Don't get your hopes up. You're not that special," he replied with a hint of sarcasm. I glared at him, while the sobbing from the attic grew louder, snapping me back to reality. "Damn, I wish he'd just shut up," I muttered. "That's exactly why you're important," he said softly. "Because I hate that little devil in the attic?" I quipped, immediately regretting my words. "Sorry." "No, it's because you can see and hear what others can't. It isn't some world-altering prophecy, just something unusual. You're special, but not in an omnipotent way," he tried to explain before being interrupted again. Anyway, I stepped onto the porch, and there, right by the door, stood someone. I asked him to step aside so I could come in, but he wouldn't budge. When I looked up, all I saw was a blinding, ominous red. A large, humanoid figure, without any trace of skin, stood there. I ordered him one last time to move. He leaned in, met my gaze, and exuded the smell of cold metal and decay. Then I heard him whisper, "He's lucky to have you. So many fear cats." After that, he crept up the stairs to your room, slipped into your little bed, and watched over you as you slept. That night, many guests visited your room. Some just came to say, "Hello." Others stared at me, and some even demanded that I vanish. But I stayed, as I was meant to. Guests have always been here. "Why are there suddenly more?" I asked. "Because the rain has stopped," Felix replied simply. By that point, it was very late, and exhaustion had finally taken hold as my mind raced with all these inexplicable happenings. I wrapped Felix in my arms, held him tight, and thanked him for everything, his stories, and for protecting me all these years. Before I close, let me share one last episode from last night. Though many things now seem to fall into place, my house remains cursed, and not every guest is as benign as the man in the brown coat, or even Felix. I was sitting at my old desk by the bedroom window, lost in a book I had been determined to finish over winter break. As I glanced up from the pages, I noticed something in the window's reflection, a faint image behind me. I turned around, but there was no one. Felix was nowhere to be seen. Even though he's dead, he still wanders these halls. I tried refocusing on my book, but the words blurred before my eyes, so I set it aside and looked out the window again. Once more, something appeared behind me, a hazy, blue, fog-like veil. I spun around and discovered a small boy, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, with a peculiar, constant smile and not a single tooth in his grin. "Hey," I greeted, both as a salutation and a question. The boy only smiled wider, extending his hand, and in it lay a single, solitary tooth. "Have you seen my little teeth?" he asked. "Maybe I have," I replied hesitantly, my thoughts still haunted by the memory of the countless teeth that had once covered our floors. "Have you seen my teeth? He took them, and I need them back," he repeated with a childlike determination. "Who took your teeth?" I asked, concern rising. At that moment, an ordinary human laugh echoed. I glanced toward the doorway and saw a man, his face hidden beneath a deeply pulled-down straw hat. Lifting the hat slightly with a finger, he offered a chilling smile, and his mouth revealed rows of sharp, tiny teeth, like those of a predator. He winked at me, and before I could fully process what had happened, both he and the boy had vanished. A few minutes later, Felix reappeared in my room. I recounted the encounter with the boy and the unsettling man with the pointed teeth. "That doesn't sound good at all," he murmured. "Do you think he'll try to take my teeth?" I asked, voice trembling. "I won't let that happen. It's my duty to protect you," Felix stated firmly, before nudging my book off the desk and curling back onto my bed, once again pretending to sleep. And so, life in this cursed mansion continues. A surreal blend of old memories, ghostly protectors, and eerie new guests. Every night, as I lie in bed, listening to the quiet weeping from the attic and the soft murmurs beneath my bed, I can only wonder what new secrets this old New Orleans house will reveal next. It began on a dismal Friday night in Detroit, a city whose faded industrial glory had given way to crumbling neighborhoods and whispered legends. I worked at the county morgue, a grim facility nestled in a decaying brick building on the outskirts of a once thriving industrial district. Every evening, as I clocked in for another night of monotony, the chill in the corridors hinted at more than just the winter's bite. The building's long, narrow hallways and sterile, flickering fluorescent lights created a setting where time itself seemed to falter. That night, a relentless storm battered the city. The rain slashed at the tall, grimy windows of the morgue, as if intent on erasing every trace of light. I sat in the reception area behind a thick glass partition, a large wooden desk my only companion amid a pile of administrative work. The drumming of the rain and the erratic hum of malfunctioning lights formed a grim symphony. I recalled the stories told in hushed tones by colleagues, tales of restless spirits and unexplained occurrences, but had always dismissed them as mere folklore born of isolation and fatigue. Yet, as I filed paperwork that evening, an unfamiliar sensation crept over me, a disquiet that hinted at a presence beyond the ordinary. A subtle chill, not born of the storm's cold, seeped into my bones. I glanced around at the dimly lit reception area. Shadows clung to the corners in unnatural shapes, and the occasional flicker of the overhead light seemed to expose glimpses of movement where nothing should be. Outside, the wind howled through broken window panes, lending the scene an eerie soundtrack to an unfolding nightmare. I decided to take a short walk through the facility, hoping a change of scenery might dispel the oppressive feeling. As I moved down the corridor, the sound of my footsteps echoed hollowly against the worn tiles. The further I ventured, the more the oppressive silence of the building seemed to press in on me, as if the walls themselves were listening. I found myself drawn toward the area where the refrigerated storage rooms were located, a place where the air was already frigid and heavy with the smell of disinfectant and decay. At the far end of a narrow hall, a single door stood slightly ajar. Beyond it, a low, pulsing light glimmered weakly. I hesitated only a moment before pushing the door open, revealing a cramped storage room lined with ancient freezers and stacked body bags. In the corner of the room, a narrow gap in one of the freezers allowed a pale, greenish light to filter out. It was as if the light were beckoning me, pulsing in a rhythm that echoed the irregular beat of my anxious heart. I stepped closer, drawn by a mix of morbid curiosity and dread. In that moment, the door behind me slammed shut with a force that sent a jolt of terror through my system. I spun around, my eyes straining to adjust to the dim glow of the room. There, barely visible in the wavering light, stood a figure, a shape that was neither entirely human nor clearly spectral. Its features were blurred, and the sadness in its presence was almost palpable. I stood frozen, my mind wrestling with the impossible reality that I was witnessing something beyond explanation. The storm outside raged on, and I felt as though the entire building had come alive with ancient secrets. The pulsating light, the sudden slam of the door, and that half-formed apparition all conspired to erode the rational part of my mind. I could not tell whether I was trapped in a waking nightmare or if the relentless despair of the morgue had finally taken its toll on me. But one thing was certain. The normalcy of my routine life was irrevocably shattered. In that moment, I sensed that the morgue itself was a nexus of something far older and more sinister than the passing of time. A presence that had waited in the shadows for decades, hungry for acknowledgement. My pulse thundered in my ears as I struggled to regain control. With a trembling hand, I reached for the light switch on the wall, as if hoping that the simple act of restoring brightness might banish the encroaching darkness. But as the fluorescent bulbs flickered back on, the eerie figure remained, unchanging, a silent witness to my terror. I could feel its gaze on me, a cold, unyielding stare that cut through the veil of rationality. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, the figure dissipated into the shadows, leaving behind only the echo of its presence and the lingering chill of a force that defied explanation. The following evening, I returned to work as if on autopilot. I arrived at the morgue in my worn jacket and tired eyes, expecting another long night of paperwork and the usual routine. The building, despite the previous night's events, showed no outward signs of disturbance. The reception area was quiet, the lights humming softly above, and the familiar scent of antiseptic hung in the air. I greeted my colleagues with brief nods and settled into my desk without remarking on the events of the prior night. Throughout the early hours, I carried on with my tasks in an almost mechanical manner. Phone calls, filing documents, and managing the routine influx of visitors filled the time. I made sure to ignore the persistent feeling that I was being watched, a sensation that had grown markedly stronger after that unsettling encounter in the storage room. The atmosphere in the morgue, while oppressive, was unremarkable during these first hours. I focused on my work and tried to convince myself that the experience had been a momentary lapse, perhaps a trick of my mind in the low light and oppressive silence of the facility. Around midnight, during a brief break, I decided to walk the halls of the morgue again. I moved slowly, with no particular destination in mind, simply allowing my feet to carry me through the long corridors. The building was silent, except for the regular buzz of the lights and the distant hum of the storm outside. I passed by the refrigerated storage rooms, their doors closed, and the room where I had seen the pulsing light remained undisturbed. There was no sign of movement, no indication that anything had changed. Despite the apparent normalcy, I could not shake the memory of the figure I had encountered. It lingered in the back of my mind like an unwelcome thought, a reminder that perhaps my mind was no longer entirely in control. I paused in front of a window and looked out onto the rain-soaked street, the reflection of the city's neon signs flickering in the puddles below. The storm had abated somewhat, and the rain now fell in a steady, rhythmic pattern that seemed almost mundane compared to the terror of the previous night. Returning to my desk, I resumed my work with a sense of determined normalcy. I avoided any conversation about the incident, not wanting to disrupt the calm that the morgue's routine had re-established. My colleagues appeared indifferent to any supernatural happenings, their expressions unchanged by the small oddities that occasionally occurred in the facility. In their eyes, it was simply the way things were. A place where life and death intersected daily, and where unusual occurrences were not entirely unexpected. Yet, as the night wore on, I began to notice subtle differences. There were moments when the lights would flicker more persistently, or when the hum of the machinery in the storage rooms took on an almost rhythmic quality. I could not help but wonder if these small disturbances were connected to what I had seen. I made mental notes of these observations, jotting down brief remarks in a small notebook I carried with me. a habit I had picked up to document any anomalies without drawing undue attention. After my shift ended, I left the morgue without incident. The city was quiet, and the drizzle had resumed as I made my way to my modest apartment. The familiar streets of Detroit, with their mix of decay and resilience, passed by as I walked, each step echoing with the routine of everyday life. At home, I tried to convince myself that nothing out of the ordinary had happened, that the events at work were nothing more than the product of a tired mind in an environment steeped in mortality. I went to bed without revisiting the thoughts that had troubled me earlier. However, in the days that followed, I could not entirely escape the feeling that something had shifted. Small, inexplicable details began to accumulate. A door that creaked open on its own, a cold spot in a normally warm hallway, the distant sound of footsteps when no one was around. I kept my observations to myself, not daring to speak of them during the sparse, quiet conversations that took place during our break times. The morgue had become a part of my daily life, and its eerie undertones had seeped into my routine without my explicit permission. I continued my work with an effort to remain as grounded as possible. I reminded myself that I was simply an employee in a building where death was handled daily, and that the human mind was prone to overactive imaginations in such a setting. Yet, each night when I returned to work, I felt as though I were stepping into a world where the line between normality and something far more sinister was perilously thin. As time passed, the events of that first night began to blur with the ordinary occurrences of the morgue. I did not dwell on them or search for further evidence, preferring instead to allow the natural order of things to reassert itself. Still, I could not completely dismiss the feeling that I was being marked by an unseen presence, a constant reminder that I had glimpsed something beyond human understanding. In the quiet hours, while I meticulously recorded my daily tasks and observations, the memory of that inexplicable figure would occasionally resurface, a silent specter lurking at the edge of my thoughts. In the weeks that followed, the uneasy calm I had forced myself to embrace began to unravel. The morgue's corridors, once merely a backdrop to my routine, now pulsed with an intensity that was impossible to ignore. Late one night, while working alone after most of my colleagues had left, I sensed that the building was stirring with a life of its own. The wind outside had picked up again, rattling the windows with a persistent clamor, and the once familiar hum of machinery in the storage room seemed to have taken on a dissonant, almost deliberate cadence. That evening, as I sat at my desk, I received an unexpected phone call on the internal line. The voice on the other end was distorted, as if filtered through a long tunnel, and it delivered a single, chilling message. "They are coming." The word sent a shiver down my spine. I tried to trace the call, but the system logged nothing unusual. The message was brief, yet its implications were enormous. I felt the weight of an unseen presence in the room, as if someone, or something, was watching me from beyond the veil of the mundane. Determined to discover the source of these disturbances, I began to document every anomaly. I installed a small notebook in my locker and meticulously recorded times, sounds, and fleeting images that I witnessed during my late-night shifts. There were moments when the temperature would drop suddenly in the middle of a corridor, or when I caught a glimpse of a figure standing motionless in the reflection of a darkened window. Each incident, though seemingly isolated, formed a pattern, a trail of breadcrumbs leading deeper into the mysteries of the morgue. One particularly stormy night, I ventured into the back corridors, armed with nothing more than a flashlight and my notebook. The heavy rain pounded the building, and the wind moaned through broken sections of the roof. I made my way past the refrigerated storage rooms, each door marked with peeling paint and rusted numbers. My heart pounded in anticipation as I approached the room where I had seen the pulsing light on my very first night. The door creaked as I pushed it open, revealing the same narrow space filled with stacked body bags and aging freezers. This time, however, the air was noticeably colder, and the familiar greenish glow had transformed. The light now emanated from an object resting atop a small table near the far wall, a weathered wooden crate that pulsed with an almost imperceptible energy. I approached it slowly, feeling as though I were intruding upon a sacred, forbidden ritual. The crate was unremarkable in appearance, old, scarred by time and neglect, but the aura around it was anything but ordinary. Every instinct in my body screamed to turn back, yet I found myself compelled to examine it more closely. With hesitant hands, I opened the crate. Inside lay a series of small, cryptic objects, a set of old photographs, a weathered journal filled with handwritten entries, and a strange, metallic token that bore markings I could not decipher. Each item exuded an air of melancholy and mystery, as if they were remnants of a past long buried by time and secrecy. The journal's pages detailed accounts of previous events at the morgue, unexplained disappearances, eerie noises, and encounters with what could only be described as the supernatural. As I read the entries by the feeble light of my flashlight, I began to realize that I was not the first to sense that the morgue was a place of dark significance. The journal spoke of a curse of the forgotten, a legacy that had haunted the morgue for decades. The entries hinted that a series of tragic events, shrouded in secrecy, had left an indelible mark on the building, an echo of sorrow and terror that now manifested as spectral occurrences. The metallic token, cold and unyielding in my hand, seemed to pulse in time with my racing heartbeat. I could almost feel the presence of those who had suffered within these walls, their voices rising in a silent chorus of despair. As I closed the crate and retraced my steps back to the main hall, the building itself seemed to breathe with a malevolent energy. Every corridor, every shadow, now carried the weight of the past. I began to notice that even the most mundane details, the chipped paint on the walls, the faint odor of disinfectant, had taken on an ominous tone. The morgue was no longer a sterile repository for the dead. It was a living monument to tragedy and unresolved sorrow. Over the next several nights, I delved deeper into the journal's entries. I discovered names, dates, and even references to a mysterious ritual that some of the former staff had whispered about in hushed tones. There were accounts of strange figures seen roaming the halls at night, of voices that seemed to speak from the shadows, and of an inexplicable force that bound the building to its tragic history. I became obsessed with uncovering the truth behind these accounts, convinced that the answers lay hidden in the cryptic clues left behind by those who had come before me. One night, as I sat in the darkened break room reviewing my notes, the temperature in the room suddenly plummeted. I saw my breath misting in the air as a low, mournful sound began to echo around me. It was not a sound of the wind, nor of any machine I recognized. It was as if the building itself were lamenting the weight of its memories. I rose from my seat, compelled by an overwhelming need to confront the source of that sound. As I stepped into the corridor, the lamplight flickered and died, plunging me into near darkness. In that moment, I realized that I was no longer alone. The corridor was empty, save for a solitary figure standing at its far end. Its form was indistinct, cloaked in shadows that defied clear definition. I could not tell if it was a man or a specter, but the aura of sorrow and quiet desperation was unmistakable. The figure did not move or speak. It simply stared at me with eyes that seemed to hold centuries of grief. For a long, agonizing moment, we regarded each other in silence. Then, as if unwilling to bear the weight of my gaze any longer, the figure slowly dissipated into the darkness, leaving me trembling in its wake. In the following days, the atmosphere at the morgue grew increasingly oppressive. Colleagues who had once exchanged polite nods now avoided eye contact, their conversations tinged with an unspoken dread. Whispers of unexplained events circulated quietly in the break room. Stories of doors slamming shut without warning, of cold spots that moved through the corridors like specters, and of fleeting glimpses of figures that vanished as quickly as they appeared. Despite the mounting tension, no one could agree on what these phenomena signified, and most dismissed them as stress-induced hallucinations brought on by the long, isolating nights spent among the dead. I, however, could not ignore the evidence laid before me. The journal's entries and the items from the crate had unearthed memories of the morgue's haunted past, a past rife with tragedy, loss, and inexplicable occurrences. Determined to uncover the full scope of this mystery, I began to conduct my own discreet investigation. I reviewed archived records, old case files, and newspaper clippings that mentioned the morgue's history. In the yellowed pages of forgotten documents, I discovered references to a series of unsolved incidents dating back to the 1960s, a period when the building was first repurposed as a morgue. The records hinted at a series of unexplained deaths, mysterious disappearances, and even a rumored cult that had once been active in the area. Late one night, armed with my notebook and the metallic token from the crate, I decided to explore a section of the building that had been long abandoned, a series of service tunnels that ran beneath the morgue. These tunnels, known only to a few long-time employees, were said to have once been part of the building's original structure. I recalled vague references in the journal about hidden passageways that might hold the key to understanding the curse of the forgotten. With my flashlight in hand, and my pulse thundering in my ears, I found a concealed door behind a stack of old supply crates in a rarely used storage closet. The door creaked open onto a narrow, dust-choked corridor that descended into darkness. Every step I took echoed in the confined space, and the oppressive atmosphere seemed to intensify with each passing moment. The air was heavy with the scent of mold and decay, and my flashlight beam trembled as it swept across ancient graffiti, rusted pipes, and the remnants of forgotten machinery. I pressed forward, driven by an insatiable need to understand what lay beneath the surface. Deep in the tunnel, I encountered a small chamber that appeared to have once been used as a storage room. The walls were lined with filing cabinets and boxes, their labels faded beyond recognition. On a rickety wooden table in the center of the room, I discovered a collection of personal belongings, old photographs, letters, and trinkets that spoke of lives long past. Among these relics was a leather-bound diary, its pages brittle with age. The entries in the diary were written in a hurried, almost desperate scrawl, and they detailed the experiences of a former morgue worker who claimed to have witnessed supernatural events. The diary recounted strange rituals, inexplicable voices, and a pervasive sense of malevolence that had driven many to madness. As I pored over the diary, a sudden echoing noise startled me from my concentration. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, reverberated through the tunnel. I froze, my heart pounding as I strained to see what might be approaching. The sound grew louder, each step measured and unhurried, as though whoever or whatever was coming had all the time in the world. I ducked behind a filing cabinet, my breathing shallow and rapid, as I peered into the darkness. A tall, gaunt figure emerged from the shadows, its features obscured by a long coat and a wide-brimmed hat. It moved with an eerie grace, as if gliding rather than walking, and its eyes shone with an otherworldly light that sent chills down my spine. For what felt like an eternity, the figure paused at the far end of the chamber and surveyed the room. I could not see its face clearly, but the aura of sorrow and regret that emanated from it was unmistakable. Then, as quietly as it had appeared, the figure turned and vanished into the tunnel, leaving behind a silence so complete it felt suffocating. I emerged from my hiding place, my hands shaking as I clutched the diary and token. I knew then that the secrets of the morgue were far deeper and darker than I'd ever imagined, and that the past was not content to remain buried. Back above ground, the evidence I had gathered began to coalesce into a disturbing narrative. The diary spoke of a tragic event, a night of unspeakable loss, when lives were taken under mysterious circumstances, and the souls of the departed were left to wander the halls of the morgue in search of redemption or revenge. The metallic token, I now understood, was a symbol, a talisman imbued with the power to open hidden doors between the living and the dead. It was a relic of a time when rituals and superstitions ruled, and its presence in the morgue was a constant reminder of the building's haunted legacy. The final nights at the morgue arrived with an intensity that defied all previous experiences. The building seemed to shudder with anticipation, as if it were aware that its secrets were on the verge of being fully exposed. The once muted whispers of the past had grown into a cacophony of voices, echoes of grief and despair that resonated in every corner of the facility. I found myself unable to escape the sense that an inevitable reckoning was at hand, a moment when the ghosts of the forgotten would rise and demand their due. Determined to confront the darkness head-on, I gathered every scrap of evidence I had collected, the diary, the token, and my numerous notes on the unexplained phenomena, and resolved to perform one final investigation. I arranged to work the longest shift possible, knowing that the silence of the early hours would be the stage upon which the morgue's secrets would finally reveal themselves. My trusted colleague reluctantly agreed to assist, though his eyes betrayed a deep-seated fear of what we might unearth. We set up a small recording device in the storage room where the pulsing green light had first appeared, and we made plans to document every anomaly with unwavering diligence. That night, the storm returned with a vengeance. Rain hammered the building's exterior, and the wind carried with it an almost mournful wail. The morgue was cloaked in darkness, save for the sporadic glow of our recording equipment and the dim emergency lights that had long been forgotten. Every shadow seemed to harbor a secret, every creak of the floorboards a prelude to a revelation. As the night deepened, so too did the intensity of the paranormal occurrences. The greenish light pulsed more rapidly, its rhythm now synchronized with a series of unearthly sounds that emanated from deep within the walls. At precisely 2:13 a.m., the recording device captured a low, resonant chant, a series of words that sounded both ancient and sorrowful, as if recited by a choir of lost souls. The sound reverberated through the corridor, mingling with the pounding of the rain and the howling wind outside. My colleague and I exchanged a glance that spoke of shared terror and disbelief. The moment was both surreal and inescapably real. We were witnessing the living manifestation of a curse, a bridge between the realm of the living and the domain of the dead. Emboldened by the evidence, we retraced our steps to the service tunnels. The path we had taken before now seemed transformed. Every detail was amplified by the oppressive atmosphere. The walls pulsed with the same rhythm as the token in my hand, and the air grew thick with the weight of memories that had long been suppressed. In a moment of both dread and determination, I led my colleague back to the hidden chamber where I had found the diary. There, in the half-light, I laid out all the pieces of the puzzle in a desperate bid to understand the full extent of the curse. As I read aloud the final, desperate entries of the diary, the temperature dropped precipitously. The walls seemed to close in on us as if the very structure of the building were trying to imprison our souls. In the distance, the chanting grew louder, echoing from every corner of the tunnel system. My colleague's voice trembled as he recorded the phenomenon, while I struggled to maintain my composure. The final entry in the diary spoke of a ritual, a last, fateful act intended to sever the ties between the living and the dead. It hinted at a sacrifice, a necessary price to pay for the release of the trapped souls, and warned that should the ritual fail, the curse would consume all who dwelled within the morgue. At that moment, a palpable force seemed to surge through the tunnel. The lights flickered and then went out entirely, plunging us into a darkness so complete it felt as though it were a physical presence. In that void, the chanting reached a fevered pitch, and I could feel an unseen hand brush against my shoulder. My heart hammered in my chest as I fumbled for my flashlight. And when the beam finally cut through the darkness, I saw them. An assembly of spectral figures, their forms shifting and indistinct, converging upon us in a silent, inexorable procession. Time lost all meaning as we stood there, frozen by terror. The figures moved with a solemn purpose, their eyes reflecting a sorrow that transcended mortal understanding. One of them, a particularly gaunt apparition with eyes that burned with a cold, fierce light, stepped forward and extended a hand as if offering a benediction or a curse. In that agonizing moment, I understood that the legacy of the morgue was not merely a collection of haunted memories, but an active force, a living, breathing entity that demanded recognition and retribution. I raised the metallic token in a trembling gesture, aware that it was the key to unlocking the ritual described in the diary. The spectral figure's gaze never wavered as I placed the token into a carved indentation in the wall, a hidden mechanism I had discovered among the relics of the abandoned chamber. A deep, resonant hum filled the air, and the token began to glow with an intense, almost blinding light. The ground trembled, and the very structure of the tunnel seemed to shatter under the force of the awakening curse. My colleague, his voice barely audible, urged me to step back. But in that moment, I felt compelled to see the ritual through, to confront the dark truth that had haunted the morgue for decades. The glowing token bathed the chamber in an unearthly radiance, revealing ghostly inscriptions on the walls, symbols that spoke of eternal sorrow, of lives torn asunder by the relentless march of time and tragedy. The chanting reached a crescendo, and I could feel the presence of countless souls pressing in from all sides, their silent pleas merging into a single, mournful cry. As the light faded slowly and the chanting began to die away, an overwhelming silence descended. The spectral figures receded, leaving behind a void that was both empty and filled with unspoken promises. My colleague and I stood in stunned silence, our minds reeling from what we had witnessed. We knew that the ritual had opened a door, a fragile, trembling portal between our world and the realm of the dead. And though the immediate terror had subsided, a deep and abiding uncertainty lingered. In the final moments of that harrowing night, as I gathered my scattered thoughts and prepared to leave the service tunnels, I glanced back at the hidden chamber. The inscriptions on the wall, now dim and inscrutable, seemed to pulse with a latent energy. A reminder that some doors, once opened, cannot be closed. I left the morgue with more questions than answers, burdened by the knowledge that the curse was far from over. The legacy of the forgotten had been reawakened, and its reach now extended beyond the cold, sterile walls of the morgue, into the very fabric of my existence. It all began last month when my friends and I set out on a birthday road trip across Texas. We were all 21, finally of legal age and eager to savor the local barbecue joints, honky-tonks, and wide-open skies that define the Lone Star State. The carefree spirit of Texas had us enchanted as we cruised down dusty highways, laughing and singing along to classic country tunes. Late one night, I found myself the only sober driver, steering our rented van along a lonely stretch of road bordered by ancient oak trees and sprawling mesquite. Our group had made a brief stop in the isolated town of Silver Creek, a place whispered about in local legends as eerie and mysterious. The narrow, weathered streets and a scattering of time-worn wooden structures lent the town an almost storybook quality. After parking the van in a deserted lot on the outskirts, where the cracked asphalt and faded neon signs hinted at better days, I decided to take a short walk. I switched off the engine and gazed through the windshield at the star-strewn, ink-black sky. The vast darkness, punctuated only by the twinkle of celestial bodies, and the gentle sway of the oaks stirred within me an irresistible curiosity. With everyone else asleep, I reasoned that a little exploration wouldn't hurt. So, quietly, I slipped out of the van and stepped into the cool, damp night. Using my cell phone as a feeble light, I made my way across the gravel lot. Before me stretched endless rows of ancient trees, their branches whispering softly in the night breeze. Above, the heavens arched in a magnificent tapestry of glittering stars, their familiar constellations standing the test of time. But then, a sudden, inexplicable chill crept over me, reminiscent of the old tales of roaming coyotes and even legends of spectral figures haunting these lands. Despite a growing sense of unease, I pressed on, careful not to disturb the overgrown brush beneath my feet. In the distance, barely illuminated by my weak light, I noticed an old wooden fence lying just behind the van. It seemed harmless enough, a small breach of propriety, and I thought a quick climb over wouldn't hurt. So I did just that. On the other side, my sneakers sank into the sodden, muddy ground. Before me lay a small pond, its banks choked by wild brush and tall cattails, entirely encircled by the ancient fence. The water, murky and unsettling, was said in local lore to be guarded by a cursed spirit. As I inched closer and peered into the dark water, I caught sight of a faint ghostly glow at the edge of my vision. I lifted my gaze, and then I froze in astonishment. Hovering above the pond was a spectral figure, one that radiated more light than shadow. Her bare, almost unearthly pale skin shimmered in the dim light, and long, damp, silver hair cascaded around her face. Her features possessed a dreamlike beauty, undefinable yet utterly mesmerizing, as if glimpsed only in the fleeting depths of a half-remembered dream. Without warning, she drifted toward me. Panic surged within me, but the soft mud clung to my feet, anchoring me in place. I lay paralyzed as she slowly knelt beside me. With delicate hands, she cupped my face, and an inexplicable warmth spread through my entire body, both soothing and ominous all at once. Her voice emerged quietly, a strange blend of gentle chimes and melodic whispers whose words I could not decipher. My heart pounded fiercely as if it might burst from my chest, while every instinct to flee was stifled. Finally, as she leaned in to press a tender kiss upon my forehead, the world around me dissolved into impenetrable darkness. I awoke drenched and disoriented on the cold floor of the van, the early morning sun timidly filtering through the small windows. My friends were still deep in sleep as I sat there, heart pounding and eyes wide with terror, the memory of that surreal encounter flooding back in every detail. Overwhelmed by fear, I frantically searched every shadow and corner, praying that the apparition would not return. Then, as quietly as I had arrived, I left the van without waking anyone, too shaken to discern whether what I had experienced was real or a bizarre hallucination. With trembling hands, I changed into fresh clothes after hastily cleaning off the clinging mud and dampness. But barely had I donned my new shirt when a sudden, intense wave of nausea seized me. A queasy churn rose in my stomach and throat, and before I could stop it, I vomited uncontrollably onto the cracked, worn floor. Stunned, I stared at the filthy water pooling beneath me, a mirror reflecting a heavy, leaden sky. Deep inside, I sensed that this was no mere coincidence but a dark secret meant to remain buried. By afternoon, when my friends finally awoke and gathered at a traditional diner about 50 miles from Silver Creek, a cozy establishment serving hearty breakfasts of biscuits, gravy, eggs, and strong coffee, I dared to recount my ordeal. Last night I saw something supernatural, I began hesitantly. One of my friends, Marcia, nearly choked on her biscuit as she burst into a nervous laugh. "What do you mean, supernatural?" she stuttered. David and Samuel exchanged skeptical glances. "I swear I experienced something. I tried to continue, but the memory slipped away, leaving only a lingering, oppressive dread. "Come on, it was probably just a deer," David finally said, and with that, the conversation faded as quickly as it had begun. Only when I returned home and began experiencing strange physical symptoms, a persistent, unexplained itch that left my arms raw from incessant scratching, did I seek medical help. The doctor gave me a quick examination, prescribed a cream for the itch, and advised me to rest. Yet in my dreams the mysterious call of that otherworldly presence echoed repeatedly, as if it were trying to impart a secret message. Over the next few days, my condition worsened. On the third day, a new, unsettling symptom emerged. A faint, persistent ringing, reminiscent of an old church bell tolling in the distance, invaded my ears. With every solitary chime, my vision blurred, and restful sleep became impossible. The sound gnawed at my mind, eroding my sanity until I found myself too exhausted to keep my eyes open. It felt as though this eerie affliction would claim me within a week. My mind began to crumble. With each passing hour, fragments of my memories faded away. In the midst of everyday tasks, whether talking on the phone with my parents, jotting down notes, or sifting through old photographs, my recollection slipped away, as if my very willpower were being siphoned into an abyss. Text messages seemed to answer themselves before I could even read them, yet no one around me appeared truly concerned. It was as if something relentless and unstoppable was slowly, yet inexorably, stripping away my body and soul. Today, as I face the certainty that my end is near, I realize that this is not the death of a rotting body hidden away in a forgotten room. No. It is the death of the mind, the fading of consciousness, the extinguishing of my very soul. That eerie entity, a remnant of Texas's old shadowed legends, has devoured every part of me, absorbing all the precious memories I once held dear, to the point where I can scarcely recall my mother's face. All I long for in these final hours is to once again be cradled in warm, protective arms. A small comfort amid the inexorable march of fate. Do I have an alcohol problem? I'll admit it. I'm far from sober. And am I one of the best paranormal investigators to ever walk this earth? Probably. I still remember my very first encounter with a ghost as if it were yesterday. It happened on my prom night at my old Midwestern high school. A night that also marked the moment I got really, really drunk. While I was retching in the women's restroom of the school's locker room, I suddenly heard soft, almost imperceptible sobbing coming from one of the stalls. Wiping my mouth with the back of my hand, I turned around and immediately felt that something was very wrong. There, in the dim light, I caught sight of a girl huddled in one of the stalls. The toilet seat was left down, and she sat with her head bowed. Her long, dark hair concealed most of her face, but the sound of her weeping and the trembling of her shoulders betrayed a profound, overwhelming sorrow. I cleared my throat, my voice wavering as I managed a hesitant, "Hello, I didn't hear you come in. You really startled me." I even let out a nervous laugh, though she offered no response. Taking a few careful steps closer, I noticed something odd. In the weak glow of the fluorescent lights, details were hard to pick out, but one thing struck me immediately. Her clothing was plain, almost old-fashioned, like something straight out of the 80s, and it didn't look like she'd bothered with any sort of makeup for the dance. I was sure I'd never seen her around before. "Are you okay? Is there anything I can do to help?" I asked gently. Only quiet, muffled sobs replied. I offered again, "Would you like to talk about it?" Then my eyes were drawn to her hands. They were oddly outstretched, as if trying to keep her from touching something. A subtle, disquieting detail. As I edged even closer, I saw it. Slow drips of blood trickled from her palms. It was clear she'd cut her wrists. "My God, what did you do?" I cried out, panic rising in my chest. We need to get you to a hospital. Come on, stand up." I leaned forward to grasp her shoulder and help her up, but my hand passed right through her. Shock widened my eyes. This couldn't be real. I reached out once more, but again my hand met nothing but empty air. Then, almost as if summoned by my terror, the girl slowly lifted her head, and before I could fully register her face, she had vanished into thin air, leaving me stumbling and crashing onto the cold, tiled floor of the restroom. It took minutes for the gravity of what had happened to sink in. My first instinct was to comb through the internet and dig into the archives of my old high school. To my disbelief, I uncovered a chilling fact. Back in 1986, a tragedy had occurred at that very school. A student named Anna had taken her own life in one of the restrooms. In that moment, it hit me. I had seen a ghost. At first, I struggled to believe it, but as the reality began to set in, I embarked on a series of experiments. I started visiting every reputedly haunted spot across the country: abandoned mansions, decrepit factories, run-down boarding houses, searching for another glimpse of the otherworldly. Nothing ever quite matched the intensity of that prom night encounter. Finally, I resolved to recreate the atmosphere of that fateful evening by returning to the old-school restroom. Of course, I was promptly barred from entering, as ex-students weren't allowed to trespass on school property. Frustration led me to an all-too-familiar solution. I turned once again to the bottle. And, well, it worked. I eventually reoriented my career as a freelance paranormal investigator. One thing I've learned over the years is that many in this business are nothing more than showmen. People who don't truly believe in ghosts but craft elaborate tales to profit from the sorrow of those left behind. Still, I encountered genuine souls who wanted nothing more than to help. But that isn't the point here. What I'm about to share is the most horrifying experience of my life. 2 years ago, when I was still a relative newcomer in the field, I received a desperate call from a middle-aged couple in New Orleans. They pleaded with me to help locate their missing twin daughters, reported missing for 2 agonizing months. Officially, the case had been classified as a kidnapping, and while the police investigations trudged along, the parents were inconsolable. They admitted over the phone that they'd never believed in the supernatural. Psychics and ghost stories were completely foreign to them, but in their despair, they clung to any hope for answers. With a heavy heart, I set out on a 3-hour drive, taking a brief detour to pick up a bottle of American rye to steady my nerves. I arrived at their stately, family-run home in one of New Orleans' oldest neighborhoods, a place that, despite its genteel exterior, exuded an eerie, foreboding aura. The closer I got, the colder the air became, as if a sudden Louisiana winter had crept in overnight. It felt unreal, even though I was mostly sober. At the door, a weary woman greeted me, her face marred by deep circles and fresh tears. She eyed the bottle in my hand with a mix of curiosity and sorrow. "Good evening. Are you the investigator?" she asked hesitantly. "Yes, that's me," I replied quickly. "Oh, please, come in," she murmured in a frail voice. Inside, I found her husband seated at a massive oak table in the living room, absorbed in reading the local newspaper. His tired eyes, when he rose to greet me and shake my hand, held a glimmer of skepticism, which wasn't surprising given the bottle of rye in my hand. "Mr. and Mrs. Carter, I'm truly sorry for what's happened to your daughters. I promise I'll do everything in my power to help." "Could you tell me more about them?" I asked softly. Mr. Carter cleared his throat before beginning. "They're twins, Sarah and Lisa. We named them that because we wanted their names to echo one another." His voice faltered. "They're both 11, Mrs. Carter added, her voice trembling. "Sarah loves the color green, while Lisa has always adored blue. I just want them back." Mr. Carter then draped his arm around her and said, "We're not even sure if they're still alive. The police seem to doubt anything will come of this search, but we're desperate and willing to try anything." I frowned inwardly, wondering why they'd mentioned the police's doubts but pushed the thought aside. "My methods might seem unconventional," I continued, "but as I mentioned on the phone, I need you both to stay elsewhere for a few hours, just for as long as I'm working here. Is that okay?" Yes," Mr. Carter replied. He seemed on the verge of saying more, but I interjected, "I know you've secured your valuables. I have no intention of taking anything." They exchanged uncertain looks, and Mrs. Carter reminded me, "The upstairs bathroom is under renovation. Please, use the one downstairs if you need to go." "Understood," I said, setting my bottle on the table. "Also, I'd appreciate a glass and some orange juice if you have any." About half an hour later, after the rye had begun to take its effect, I noticed a shift in the atmosphere. Mr. and Mrs. Carter left the house to catch a movie. A puzzling decision in the wake of their unimaginable loss, but perhaps they needed a distraction from the torment of the past 2 months. As a warm buzz filled my stomach, I sensed an oppressive heaviness in the air, a blend of grief and anguish so palpable it nearly choked me. Yet, beneath that, there was another, more sinister undercurrent of anger, almost cruel in its intensity. I rose slowly from my chair, letting my empty glass clatter to the floor, still lucid enough to think clearly. As I moved through the living room, determined to track the source of this strange energy, a high, almost whispering voice suddenly cut through the silence. "Upstairs." I spun around and saw, by the doorway, the blurred, indistinct silhouettes of 2 children. They stood there as if emerging from a dream, just behind the living room door. For a moment, I swallowed back a scream. Yes, they were unmistakably gone from this world. But why would they appear here? Did it mean that whoever had abducted them had already killed them in the house? "Sarah, Lisa," I called out, struggling to steady my trembling voice. In an eerie, synchronized murmur, they replied, "Needle and thread." I blinked in disbelief, unable to comprehend how their small, delicate bodies seemed fused together as if stitched by fate. Their appearance was ghostly, a faded sketch barely clinging to existence. And then, just as suddenly, they vanished. "Wait!" I shouted in horror, the word echoing in the silent corridor. I recalled the earlier clue, upstairs. With shaking legs, I climbed the creaking stairs to the 2nd floor. As I reached the landing, I caught a fleeting glimpse of the twins standing there, their eyes fixed on me before they melted away into nothingness. "Lisa? Sarah?" I cried out in despair as I stood in an endless hallway. Suddenly, I felt the icy brush of a dead child's lips against my ear. Frozen with terror, I didn't dare turn around. I stood immobile until a faint whisper, a mere breath, uttered 2 words. "The bathroom." My heart pounded as I realized what that meant. The renovated bathroom, of course. I hurried down the hall, passing the parents' bedroom, once filled with children's toys, now a somber reminder of a lost innocence, and another flight of stairs. At the end of the corridor, I finally reached the door. It was locked, as expected, due to the ongoing renovations. I pounded on it, and after a few minutes of desperate effort, the old frame finally gave way. Inside, everything looked normal at first glance. Nothing seemed amiss. I scrutinized every corner of the room but found nothing out of place. "Damn," I muttered, unsure of how I would explain this to the Carters. Then they reappeared. The twins stood in the center of the room, their large, pleading eyes fixed on me. This time, I noticed with chilling clarity what was horribly wrong. Their bodies were grotesquely fused at the sides, and the ragged clothing they wore was stained with blood and dirt. It took a few agonizing seconds for the gruesome truth to sink in. Needle and thread. "No, no, 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 please tell me. You had to have been forced to let this happen," I whispered in shock. One of the girls softly tapped her bare foot on the cool tile. I knelt down and, with trembling hands, pulled out my pocket knife to pry at the grout between several newer, cleaner tiles, a stark contrast to the decaying rest of the floor. The mortar looked freshly applied, as if the renovation had been done recently. My heart pounded as I worked feverishly until a loose tile finally shifted. Using the knife as a lever, I lifted it and was met with the hollow, empty eye sockets of a decomposing head. The stench that wafted out was almost unbearable. I looked up into the sorrowful wet eyes of the twins now hovering before me. The girl on the left reached out and gently touched what remained of that ghastly visage. "That's me," she murmured. Tears welled in my eyes. Who did this to you?" I asked, though I already sensed the answer lurking in the silence. "Daddy did terrible things," the girl on the right whispered. "And Mommy..." "She was even worse," the left one added softly. I nodded silently, pulled out my cell phone, and dialed 911. When the dispatcher asked what had happened, I simply stated, "I found the bodies of the missing children." After hanging up, I turned back to the twins. "You said you'd be back in 10 minutes. Can you please tell me exactly what happened?" The twins exchanged a somber look before the girl on the right spoke in a trembling voice. "Mommy wouldn't feed us. We were starving. We tried to run, but they caught us. Needle and thread. Needle and thread." We sat in an agonizing silence for what felt like an eternity. As I gazed into their eyes, the sadness slowly began to ease into something less oppressive. Suddenly, a loud knock on the front door shattered the stillness. I leaped to my feet. "They're here," I muttered. "Are you okay?" I called out, though their forms began to flicker and fade, dissolving into nothingness before my eyes. In a heartbeat, they were gone. I wiped away my tears and dashed down the stairs to answer the door. Explaining what I had found to the police was a drawn-out affair. Officially, they concluded, the investigators stumbled upon the bodies by chance. Absolute nonsense. Frankly, I didn't care. They could believe whatever they wanted. The Carters were almost immediately arrested, and their confession turned out to be as horrifying as I'd suspected. Allegedly, Mrs. Carter suffered from a severe psychological disorder that led to sudden outbursts of rage, while Mr. Carter vented his frustrations on the girls. After forcing the twins to endure 2 days of starvation, they had attempted to escape. But they hadn't gotten far. Needle and thread, those 3 words have been seared into my memory ever since. It was the cruel method by which they died. I don't know how long their stitched-together bodies managed to linger before finally giving out, but it couldn't have been long. After they died, their parents concealed the bodies beneath the newly laid bathroom tiles, a detail that had escaped the notice of the investigators for far too long. Evidently, the Carters had planned every detail to craft the perfect picture of grieving parents by hiring a paranormal investigator. They never expected me to uncover the truth. Of course, that surprised them. After all, I was known in this field as the one with the least credibility. Not everyone believes in ghosts, but sometimes it's the living who harbor the most unspeakable horrors within. What did you expect when I said I would tell you about the scariest experience of my life? Perhaps a demon or some other supernatural force. I'm sorry if I disappoint you. Ironically, in the end, it wasn't the dead, but 2 very much living people who inflicted the greatest terror upon me. And as for the twins, I truly hope they now rest in peace. Somehow, I feel they're finally free from all that pain. It began on a night when the tempest raged over Baltimore with a fury that seemed to rip the very fabric of reality. I had seen storms before in this city, the kind that swept over the harbor and left the streets drenched and glistening under the weak glow of streetlights. But nothing in my 20 years at the Baltimore City morgue had prepared me for what was about to unfold. I was Mark, a quiet observer in a world where death was handled with clinical detachment. And yet that night, as the wind howled around the aging brick walls of the morgue, an uneasy feeling crept up in me. It was as if the storm had a secret of its own, a secret that would soon shatter the monotony of my carefully measured existence. I remember the first moment I sensed it. The rain was lashing against the tall windows of our facility, its sound merging with the distant echoes of sirens and the rumble of thunder that vibrated through the cold corridors. In the midst of this chaos, the usual routine was abruptly interrupted by the arrival of an ambulance. The vehicle, its red lights flashing like desperate beacons in the gloom, pulled up near the rear entrance. As the paramedics hurried inside, they bore an object that would soon dominate every thought in my mind. A stretcher carrying a young woman whose presence seemed to defy the very nature of death. I watched silently as Derek, a colleague known for his sardonic humor even in the bleakest moments, wheeled the stretcher into the reception area. His voice, usually light with mockery, carried a tone of reluctant respect as he said, "Mark, take a look at this." There was something about the way he spoke, barely disguising a sense of trepidation, that hinted at an unspoken truth. On that stretcher lay the woman, her identity reduced to the cold label, "unknown woman," in our system. Yet, as soon as I saw her, I knew she deserved a name of her own. In my mind, she became Veronica Sharp, a name that resonated with both beauty and sorrow. Veronica's appearance was almost unreal, despite the trauma inflicted by the storm. A violent encounter with a falling street sign that had left her with injuries so severe that her head appeared partially detached. There was an eerie grace about her. Her skin, pale and untouched by decay, still seemed to glow with the remnants of a life once lived. The marks of her recent suffering, the streaks of blood that mingled with the rain, only added to her spectral allure. In that moment, as I leaned in to examine her, I could almost sense that her death was not a mere accident, but the opening chapter of something far more unsettling. I found myself captivated not only by the physical details of her wounds, but by an intangible energy that radiated from her still form. It was as if she carried with her the lingering essence of an experience that transcended the ordinary. The morgue, a place where every body was a story told in measurements and photographs, now felt like a stage for an unexplainable drama. Each scar on her body whispered of a violent past, yet also hinted at an inexplicable resistance to the finality of death, a spark that defied the cold logic of our daily routines. After the initial shock, the work began. The medical examiner and the other technicians moved about with practiced precision, documenting every detail of Veronica's injuries and the conditions of her arrival. I found myself meticulously noting every nuance: the angle at which the street sign had struck her, the peculiar way the rain had washed away some of the evidence of her suffering, and the subtle play of shadows on her face that suggested a hidden depth. The clinical reports that followed were as unfeeling and systematic as always, yet my own account was laden with questions that defied the neat confines of bureaucracy. That night, as the storm subsided to a mournful drizzle, I sat in my cramped office reviewing the first notes. The fluorescent light hummed overhead, casting an artificial glow on the documents spread before me. But my mind wandered far beyond those sterile pages. I remembered the low murmur of the rain, the soft echo of footsteps in the empty halls, and the distant, almost imperceptible sound of something that could have been a whisper, an otherworldly melody that seemed to emanate from the very walls of the morgue. The idea that death could be a beginning rather than an end took root in my thoughts, a notion that filled me with both dread and a peculiar sense of anticipation. I left the office later that night for a solitary walk along the harbor. Baltimore's waterfront was shrouded in mist, the modern silhouettes of office towers and warehouses blurred by the residual rain. The city, normally so vibrant with its blend of old industry and contemporary hustle, now wore a cloak of sorrow and mystery. As I strolled along the cracked pavement, my mind replayed the events of the evening in relentless detail. I could not shake the feeling that Veronica's case was more than a tragic accident. It was a phenomenon that transcended the realm of the explainable. The hours passed slowly, and I returned to the morgue with a heavy sense of purpose. I began to pore over old records, searching for any precedent that might explain the strange circumstances surrounding Veronica's demise. The files, long neglected and gathering dust in the archives, contained routine cases of misfortune and natural disaster. Yet there was an unmistakable void where the true nature of this case should have been. Every technical measurement, every lab result, fit perfectly into the expected narrative of a violent accident. And yet, in the quiet recesses of my mind, I harbored the conviction that something vital had been left out, a crucial detail that would unravel the conventional wisdom of our work. As the night deepened into an early, indistinct morning, the hospital corridors fell silent, except for the persistent drip of water from a leaky pipe. I sat at my desk, the worn leather of my chair creaking softly under the strain of my prolonged vigil. The notes I had written became a tapestry of conflicting emotions, rational data interwoven with an almost irrational compulsion to understand the inexplicable. I could not help but feel that the storm had been a harbinger, a violent force that had swept Veronica into a fate far beyond the ordinary. And as I looked out the narrow window, watching the city begin to stir under a pallid dawn, I realized that this case had planted a seed of unease that would continue to grow, twisting my perception of reality in ways I could not yet comprehend. In the days following the storm, the official reports about Veronica Sharp's case circulated through the corridors of the morgue like a somber whisper. Colleagues carried on with their duties, their voices steady and devoid of the tremor of uncertainty that had haunted me since that night. Yet I found myself unable to let go of the nagging feeling that something was deeply amiss. Every detail, from the forensic measurements to the mundane notes about weather conditions, painted a picture of a violent, tragic accident. And yet, in the back of my mind, I could not ignore the uncanny aura that surrounded her body, a presence that seemed to linger long after death should have claimed it entirely. I began my investigation with the careful scrutiny of records. The morgue's archives, a labyrinth of yellowed files and brittle paper, held decades of cases. I pored over each document, searching for anomalies, for any hint that Veronica's case was not an isolated incident. The pattern was disturbingly uniform. Accidents, misfortunes, natural disasters, each recorded with clinical detachment. But in a few older, almost forgotten files, I noticed references to events that defied ordinary explanation. There were mentions of inexplicable energy shifts during fatal accidents, of unaccounted-for phenomena that had been quietly dismissed by subsequent investigators. These discrepancies, though minor on their own, began to coalesce into a mosaic of questions that refused to be ignored. I spent long hours in the dim light of the morgue's back room, cross-referencing data and scribbling notes into a battered journal. The natural cadence of my work was disrupted by an ever-growing awareness of something lurking beyond the tangible. I recalled how, on that stormy night, a subtle melody, barely a sound at all, had accompanied my every step. At first, I had attributed it to my overactive imagination, a byproduct of exhaustion and the oppressive atmosphere of the morgue. But as I delved deeper into the records, the melody returned to me in fragments. It was as if the building itself were alive with whispers, murmuring secrets in a language that transcended the boundaries of the ordinary. One evening, while reviewing a series of dated photographs from previous cases, I found a peculiar image tucked away between the pages of an old binder. The photograph was taken in what appeared to be the same morgue, but in a time long past, an era when the building's architecture still held the scars of history. In the faded image, a young woman with strikingly similar features to Veronica stood in a shadowed corridor, her eyes distant and sorrowful. The photograph was grainy and weathered, yet the uncanny resemblance was unmistakable. The discovery sent a shiver down my spine. Could it be that Veronica was not the first to bear the mark of an otherworldly encounter? Had the morgue, this repository of final moments, been touched by a recurring, inexplicable force throughout its long history? The more I investigated, the more I became convinced that the events surrounding Veronica's death were intertwined with something far older than any individual tragedy. The records hinted at cycles, recurring patterns that defied the rational framework of accident and misfortune. In quiet moments, when the hum of fluorescent lights faded into silence, I would recall the gentle but persistent sound that had first alerted me to her peculiar case. It was not merely the wind or the rain. It was a resonance that seemed to pulse with an eerie vitality, a reminder that even in death, some forces could not be entirely silenced. Every day I returned to the morgue, the building felt different, more charged with a presence that hovered just beyond the reach of explanation. The sterile white walls and the orderly rows of refrigerated drawers became a backdrop for my internal struggle, a struggle to reconcile the stark reality of forensic evidence with the intangible impressions of that fateful night. I began to notice subtle changes in the environment. A door left ajar where it had always been closed, a faint trace of a cold draft that lingered long after the heating system had been adjusted, and even the occasional soft echo of footsteps in corridors that should have been empty. These occurrences were fleeting, almost dismissible as tricks of the mind, yet together they formed a tapestry of uncanny details that defied logical explanation. One late afternoon, after a day filled with routine examinations and sterile procedures, I decided to visit a local library known for its extensive historical archives. I hoped that by delving into the city's past, I might uncover references to events that paralleled the mysterious aura of the morgue. The library, an imposing structure with high ceilings and rows of ancient books, was a sanctuary of calm in contrast to the restless energy I had been experiencing. There, amidst the scent of aged paper and the quiet rustle of pages, I discovered accounts of unexplained happenings in Baltimore dating back over a century. Newspapers chronicled strange accidents on stormy nights, incidents where the victims bore marks that defied ordinary explanation. There were even whispered legends of a specter of the harbor, a presence said to wander the foggy streets and alleys, its origins lost in the mists of time. The library offered no definitive answers, only a wealth of fragments, old diaries, faded photographs, and cryptic newspaper articles that hinted at a pattern of supernatural occurrences. I left with more questions than I had arrived with, but also with a newfound determination to follow the trail wherever it might lead. The connection between Veronica and the past was no longer a vague suspicion. It was a tangible thread that I had to untangle, no matter how unsettling the journey might become. Returning to the morgue one night, I resolved to pay closer attention to my surroundings. I began to record subtle changes in the ambient sounds and the play of light and shadow. During one such vigil, as I sat alone in the quiet of the morgue's back office, I swore I heard a soft murmur, almost like a voice reciting a word I could not comprehend. The sound was so faint that I questioned my own sanity, yet it was undeniably there. I tried to dismiss it as an auditory hallucination born of fatigue, but deep down, I knew that the morgue was hiding secrets that extended far beyond its clinical walls. The days merged into nights as my investigation took on a life of its own. I began to chronicle every anomaly with painstaking detail, each observation a small piece of a larger, more ominous puzzle. The mundane became extraordinary in the cold light of evidence and the even colder shadows of doubt. I visited the scene of the accident, a street near the harbor where a battered sign had once hung ominously above the pavement, and found that the memory of that violent impact was etched into the very concrete. There were cracks and fissures that, when observed carefully, formed patterns that hinted at a force far more deliberate than mere chance. At home, I could not escape the pervasive sense of foreboding. My nights were restless, haunted by dreams in which Veronica's face emerged from the darkness, her eyes pleading for salvation, even as her body lay in a grotesque mimicry of life. These dreams were vivid and unyielding, blurring the boundaries between the waking world and a realm where death and the supernatural intermingled. I awoke drenched in sweat, my heart pounding, and for hours I lay awake, listening to the silence that now seemed pregnant with unsaid truths. In the midst of this inner turmoil, I began to doubt the very foundation of my beliefs. The rational, methodical world I had built around me, the domain of facts, figures, and forensic science, was crumbling under the weight of experiences that defied explanation. I found myself questioning if death, as I had always known it, was simply a finite event, or if it was instead a gateway to something far darker and more mysterious. Every new piece of evidence, every strange occurrence, seemed to whisper of a truth that lay hidden in plain sight, a truth that the world at large was too terrified or too indifferent to acknowledge. The more I learned, the deeper I sank into a mire of uncertainty and dread. There was no neat conclusion waiting at the end of my inquiry, only a vast expanse of unanswered questions, and through it all, the memory of that stormy night, the sound of the rain, the flash of lightning, the spectral beauty of Veronica Sharp remained a constant, haunting presence. It was as if the storm had not only claimed a life, but it also opened a door to a realm where the normal rules of time and mortality no longer applied. I knew that I was venturing into dangerous territory, where the line between reality and nightmare blurred beyond recognition. Yet, despite the risks, I could not turn back. The truth was calling me, echoing in the empty corridors of my mind and in the silent spaces between each measured heartbeat. The investigation had reached a crescendo, and I found myself standing on the precipice of a revelation that was as dangerous as it was transformative. In the weeks that followed, the subtle disturbances in the morgue grew bolder. I began to notice that the ambient temperature would drop inexplicably at certain hours of the night, and on more than one occasion, I caught a glimpse of a figure, a fleeting shadow moving in the periphery of my vision, where no one else was present. It was as if the very building was reacting to the presence of something unseen, a presence that defied the sterile logic of science. One particularly bitter evening, as I was closing up the morgue, I heard a persistent knocking on the heavy metal door of the archives. It was not the hollow sound of the wind, but a deliberate rhythmic tapping that sent chills down my spine. I opened the door cautiously, half expecting to find one of my colleagues playing a cruel trick. Instead, I was met with a darkness so complete that it seemed to swallow the light entirely. In that moment, I felt the unmistakable weight of an unseen observer, as if countless eyes were watching from beyond the veil of the living. I stood frozen for what felt like an eternity before the sound subsided, leaving only a lingering sense of dread and the faint echo of a whispered name, Veronica. Unable to shake off the experience, I doubled my efforts to piece together the enigma of Veronica Sharp. Every lead I had followed, every obscure reference in the archives, pointed to a pattern that defied logical explanation. There were accounts, scattered across time, of a woman whose presence had been recorded in moments of great tragedy, a spectral figure whose appearance always coincided with inexplicable events. It was as if she were a harbinger of doom, a silent witness to forces that had long been suppressed by the mundanity of everyday life. The more I delved into the history of the morgue and the city's forgotten past, the more I began to perceive an unsettling continuity. A narrative that stretched back through the decades, binding together disparate incidents into a single, disturbing tapestry. I took to walking the deserted streets of Baltimore at night, driven by a compulsion that I could neither explain nor resist. The city by day was a blend of industry and commerce, but by night its true face emerged. A maze of dark alleys, abandoned warehouses, and forgotten corners that whispered of secrets best left undisturbed. One night, as I navigated a narrow lane near the harbor, I noticed a faint glow emanating from an old building that had long been shuttered. Drawn by a mix of curiosity and dread, I approached cautiously. The building, once a bustling warehouse, now stood silent and decaying, its windows dark and its facade marked by time and neglect. Inside, I found remnants of a life that had been abruptly abandoned. A scattering of personal belongings, dusty photographs, and a collection of old journals. As I leafed through the brittle pages of one journal, I discovered entries written in a hurried, almost desperate hand. They spoke of strange occurrences, of voices that called out in the silence of the night, and of a presence that watched from the shadows. One entry in particular caught my eye, a date from nearly 50 years ago, accompanied by a chilling description of an encounter with a figure that bore an uncanny resemblance to the Veronica I had come to obsess over. The realization that this phenomenon was not new, that it had haunted the city for decades, filled me with a sense of foreboding. It was not simply the product of a violent accident or the ravages of a storm. It was something far older and more malevolent, a force that had seeped into the very foundation of Baltimore. With each new discovery, my conviction grew that Veronica's case was a key to unlocking a mystery that stretched beyond the boundaries of conventional understanding. I began to record these findings with the precision of a scientist and the passion of a man who had lost his grip on the comforting solidity of fact. Every note, every photograph, every faded document was a piece of a puzzle that I was determined to solve, even if it meant confronting truths that could shatter the very notions of life and death. As the days turned into weeks, the paranormal manifestations in the morgue grew more intense. Equipment would malfunction inexplicably. Monitors flickered with images that were not part of the recorded data, and I sometimes felt an icy hand brushing against my shoulder when I was alone. The sense of being watched became a constant companion, as if the spirits of the past had decided to reclaim their place in a world that had long since forgotten them. I confided in a retired coroner who had once worked at the morgue, and he, with a voice heavy with regret and resignation, recounted stories of similar disturbances that had been dismissed as the product of an overactive imagination. Yet, his eyes betrayed a lingering fear, a silent acknowledgement that there were forces at work far beyond the realm of rational explanation. Late one night, while I was reviewing the collected documents in my dimly lit office, the power suddenly flickered and went out. The silence that followed was oppressive, broken only by the slow, deliberate drip of water from a leaky pipe. In the pitch black, my senses heightened to every sound and movement. I felt an overwhelming pressure, as though the darkness itself were closing in around me. Then, in the silence, I heard it once more. That faint, persistent whisper of a name, Veronica. It was not a sound produced by any human throat. It was a vibration, a resonance that seemed to emanate from the very walls of the morgue. In that moment, terror and awe warred within me. I fumbled for my flashlight and, with trembling hands, scanned the room. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but the familiar contours of the room and the long-forgotten artifacts of countless lives. Yet, the feeling of being enveloped by something other than mere absence remained. In the following days, I made one final, desperate attempt to reconcile the disparate threads of my investigation. I returned to the archives, determined to find a definitive link that could explain the recurring pattern of events. In an obscure, leather-bound volume of city records, I found mention of a case strikingly similar to Veronica's. A young woman whose mysterious death had been recorded in an era when Baltimore was a very different city. The account was terse and clinical, yet it contained an undercurrent of inexplicable horror that mirrored my own experience. It detailed a series of bizarre coincidences, a violent storm, an inexplicable electrical anomaly, and the sudden appearance of a spectral figure in the morgue that defied logical explanation. The description was chilling, written in a language that spoke of fate and inevitability rather than accident and error. The weight of that discovery pressed upon me as I pieced together the final elements of the puzzle. I realized that Veronica Sharp was not an isolated anomaly, but a manifestation of a recurring phenomenon, a spectral presence that had haunted Baltimore for generations. The evidence was all around me, in the old photographs, in the faded accounts of past tragedies, in the whispered legends of a woman who appeared at the moment of death, and in the unexplained phenomena that now plagued the morgue. It was as if the city itself was marked by a deep, unhealed wound, a wound that refused to close, its agony echoing through time and manifesting in moments of crisis. On the final night of my investigation, I returned to the morgue one last time. The building was shrouded in an almost palpable darkness, and the air was heavy with the scent of damp concrete and old secrets. I made my way to the room where Veronica's body had been kept, each step measured and deliberate. In the dim glow of a single emergency light, I stared at the spot where she had lain, recalling every detail of that fateful night. The chaotic interplay of light and shadow, the relentless beat of the rain, and the inexplicable energy that had surrounded her. In that moment, I understood that I was standing at the threshold of a truth that could never be fully explained. A truth that lurked in the spaces between memory and oblivion. As I stood there, a final, low moan echoed through the corridors of the morgue, a sound that seemed to emanate from deep within the building's ancient walls. It was a sound of lament, a cry of something lost and unforgotten. The room grew colder, and the shadows deepened, coalescing into a form that I could only describe as otherworldly. I felt an almost overwhelming presence, as though the spirits of the past had gathered to witness this final reckoning. In the shifting gloom, I caught sight of a figure in the reflection of a dusty metal tray, a faint, indistinct shape that seemed to watch me with eyes full of sorrow and warning. I could not tell if it was my mind playing tricks on me, or if I was truly in the presence of something beyond the natural order. But in that moment, I knew that my search for answers had come at a price. I had awakened forces that had lain dormant for decades, perhaps centuries, and now they were stirring in response to my relentless quest for the truth. The experience left me with a profound sense of dread, tempered only by a strange, unsettling clarity. I realized that some mysteries were not meant to be unraveled, that the boundaries between life and death, between the known and the unknowable, were drawn for a reason. In the final hours of that night, I made one last entry in my journal, a confession of my deepest fears, and an acknowledgement of the inexorable pull of the unknown. I wrote of the spectral presence, of the recurring whispers that had haunted my every step, and of the overwhelming feeling that I was now part of a narrative far larger than any one life. The words spilled onto the page in a frantic, almost desperate script, capturing the essence of my encounter with a truth that defied explanation. I sealed the journal in an envelope and tucked it away, uncertain if I would ever have the strength to confront its contents again. As dawn broke over Baltimore, the city awoke to the routine hum of everyday life, blissfully unaware of the dark forces that had been stirred in the silent hours of the night. I, too, emerged from the morgue with a heavy heart and a mind burdened by the knowledge that some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. The case of Veronica Sharp had left its mark on me, a mark that would forever blur the lines between reality and nightmare. In the quiet moments before the day fully began, I glanced back at the imposing structure of the morgue and felt an inexplicable pull, as if it were calling me back to its shadowy depths. I knew that the mystery was far from resolved, that the true horror lay not in the accident itself, but in the enduring presence that haunted the corridors of death. Could you tell me a little more about the property? Absolutely. It was built in the late 1870s in a small town in Ohio, but most of its original structure and exterior have been replaced and modernized over the years. You know how it goes. Old-world craftsmanship doesn't always match current styles and safety requirements. I know exactly what you mean, but from what you're saying, it's quite an old house. That must mean it carries a certain history. Are there any stories surrounding it? I've heard a few local legends. A neighbor once told me that during Prohibition, the place was used as a secret distillery. I also heard that Franklin D. Roosevelt supposedly had a photo taken in front of the house. Never seen any photographic proof, though. Oh, and someone once claimed that a religious cult settled in this vacant house for an entire summer. They said the members left strange markings and small scorch marks on the walls. What were they called again? The Friends of the Flame, or the Circle of Fire, something like that. That's how it was told to me, but I've got no idea if it's even true. The only story I know for certain is that a young couple with a little child lived here before we did, and prior to that, an elderly lady occupied the house. Well, if all that is true, it's definitely a property with quite a history. Old houses like this often come with their share of local legends. Sometimes that's a selling point. I'm looking at your file right now and see here that you've taken out our Golden Paranormal insurance policy, which covers hauntings, poltergeists, possessions, and death caused by supernatural occurrences. That's correct. I completely understand why you went for our top-tier policy. Given the house's age and potential backstory, it makes sense to want the best protection against ghostly activity, especially if there was indeed some sort of cult activity in the past. Actually, that's what I was going to ask about, though I'm hesitant to hear the answer. If those claims about the cult are accurate, that won't affect my coverage, right? I saw something in the contract about not covering hauntings if the spirit or entity was summoned on purpose. No, you're still fully eligible. That clause only applies if you are the one who summoned the entity. Oh good, that's a relief. Anyway, I need to discuss your claim. I see here that you're seeking $2,500 for property damage and another $9,500 for the emotional and physical stress this haunting has caused you and your family. Does that sound correct, Mr. Johnson? Yes, that's correct. Great. Now, as I'm sure you understand, I need to do my due diligence and ask a few questions about the alleged haunting. This will help me advance your claim, but you may still be subject to a visit from an investigator. Their job will be to check if your supernatural activities are genuine and whether the amount you're asking for is appropriate. Does that make sense? Yes, it does. I just hope you can process my claim quickly. My family's been through enough, and we don't want this dragging on. Well, sir, if you can describe the strange events you've experienced, we can get started. Let's begin with how the haunting started. The first incident happened just over a month ago. It was subtle at first, I nearly missed it. It was a chilly night and I was sitting by the fireplace poking around in the embers after the flames had died. My wife and the kids had already gone upstairs, and I was the only one awake, making sure the fire was totally out before heading to bed. So, I was the only one who saw it. In the ashes, for just a moment, I saw two eyes looking right at me. It's tough to describe exactly, but it appeared as if two eyeballs had formed in the coals, like they were still aflame, as though the eyes themselves were burning. They were there just for a second before the embers went back to normal. Probably something I should have written off, but in that moment I chalked it up to my tired mind playing tricks. That sounds familiar. A lot of cases I handle start out with small, almost ignorable things. Folks dismiss it as imagination, but they all escalate quickly. Let me guess, things got worse after that? Yes, unfortunately. The next thing involved our family photos. We take a lot of pride in capturing good family pictures, so we've got loads of them hanging throughout the house. I'm not sure how often we really look at them, though, so I couldn't say exactly when the damage started. But I know it was about a week after the fireplace incident when I first noticed something was off. Above the mantel, right over the fireplace, we keep 5 different pictures from various family outings. The one I noticed was taken during a trip to the zoo, actually in front of the monkey enclosure, but that's irrelevant. Point is, in that photo, all our eyes had been burned out. Tiny holes, maybe the size of cigarette burns, right where our eyes should be. Every one of us, my 3 kids, my wife, and me, all our eyes had been burned out. I was shocked when I saw it. I assumed they were cigarette burns, but neither my wife nor I smoke. So my initial panicked thought was that maybe my eldest daughter had started a secret habit. I was furious at first, but then logic set in. Even if she was smoking, that wouldn't explain why she'd go and burn out all our eyes. Then I glanced at the other photos on the mantle, same thing in each. That's when I realized it definitely wasn't the work of my daughter. In every photo in the house, the same pattern. Our eyes had been scorched away. Scorched photos. I've heard that before. I have to ask, though, was that the only property damage, or was there more? There was more. Over the next few days, the kids started noticing small scorch marks on our walls, scattered randomly throughout the house, always circular and about the size of a ping pong ball. They turned up in pairs, 2 tiny holes burned side by side. I knew there was no way a family member had done that with a cigarette. I'd guess, in those few days, between finding the first scorches and the moment we all saw him, we found maybe a dozen marks like that. What do you mean by when we all saw him? I mean exactly that. All of us laid eyes on him, the man with the flames in his eyes. Interesting. Go on. We were all gathered in the kitchen, saying grace before dinner. All of a sudden, I felt a sharp pain in my hand. When I looked, my skin was burning, literally blistering, and I caught a whiff of sizzling flesh. I screamed and jumped from my seat, shocking everyone else. I stood there, staring at my flaming hand in both agony and terror. Then I heard Maggie, my eldest, let out a shriek, which somehow snapped me back to reality. I looked up at her. She was pale as a sheet and pointing toward the far side of the kitchen. At the other end of the table, right behind my wife, stood a man staring at me, or rather, at my hand. Our eyes never met. His eyes weren't any normal color. They were blazing orange. They flickered like embers, almost as if an actual flame burned in his iris. When I looked at them, it was like staring straight into hell. A man with flame-filled eyes? Yes. Ask my wife, ask the kids. For God's sake, they all saw him, this man with burning eyes. All right, sir. Here's what happens now. If you want to pursue this claim, we'll assign an investigator to your property. He'll look for evidence of your alleged haunting, and he'll decide whether or not to grant your compensation. Do you understand? Yes. End of recording. Report for Paranormal Insurance. Case number 708. I've listened to the initial phone call regarding case number 708. I'm now fully aware of the events and the dollar amount Mr. Johnson is seeking. A thorough investigation will follow, documented below. My initial impression is that this claim may turn out to be fraudulent. I arrived at the Johnson residence on a Saturday morning at 10:34 a.m. I got out of my car, grabbed my briefcase from the passenger seat, and walked toward the house. The first thing I noticed was the property's size and beauty. I had to tip my head all the way back just to see the pointed top of the steep roof. The walls were done in a Victorian style, and the roof had light gray shingles. 4 columns supported a wide front porch that jutted from the main facade. I wouldn't call it awe-inspiring, but the place definitely looked expensive. From my vantage point, there was no visible damage outside, which was consistent with earlier descriptions. It seemed everything was happening indoors. A tall iron fence surrounded the yard, presumably to guard against external threats. The irony that their greatest threat was coming from within the house, not outside, didn't escape me. Right now, though, the biggest external threat they faced was me. The insurance investigator who might prove their story was a hoax and deny their claim. The gate automatically began to swing open, probably because the family noticed my arrival. In most cases like this, I'm greeted by someone who's either annoyed or distressed about having their claim scrutinized. They've gone through something traumatic, and the last thing they want is to keep reliving it for an investigator. But sometimes they're simply frustrated because they know it's only a matter of time before I prove the haunting to be nothing more than a scheme. I expected some hostility from Mr. Johnson and his family, assuming I was dealing with a con. Once the gate was fully open, I walked up the paved path to the front door. Waiting for me was a middle-aged man with short brown hair. He looked fairly unremarkable, dressed in casual slacks and a button-up shirt. The only odd thing was the dark sunglasses covering his face. It was a gloomy, overcast day, so there was no sunlight to shield against. He greeted me with a curt nod and a flat, "Good morning." I extended my hand in a more cordial way. He did the same, gripping my hand in return. I have to admit, though, my handshake was partly a test. As soon as he grasped my hand, I glanced down and saw 2 small scorch marks on his palm. They still looked fresh and blistered. I was almost startled by the sight of blackened skin. Either the man's claim was real, or he was going to extreme lengths to support a hoax. People in dire situations do surprising things. If you listen to that first phone recording, you may recall how the agent's tone shifted once the flame-eyed man was mentioned. You've also heard me express strong skepticism about this being a fraud. But if you're unfamiliar with the most notorious and potentially lucrative paranormal insurance claims, you won't know why this one already smells fishy. So, for the uninitiated, here's a quick explanation of why I suspected greed and deceit. About 5 years ago, there was another case with strikingly similar details. A haunted family, burned photographs, small scorch marks on walls, and sightings of a flame-eyed man. That case centered on a man named Jack Evans. He submitted a claim for damages, emotional, physical, and property, saying that he and some friends had done something foolish in their younger days. Something that allegedly drew this entity to him. Because there was no solid proof that any of it was real, it was deemed fraudulent, and no payout was made. Only after Evans' death was a substantial sum granted to his grieving family. Apparently, details from that case made the local papers. Soon enough, more folks cropped up with suspiciously similar hauntings, all claiming they, too, were tormented by the flame-eyed man. I assumed the Johnsons were part of that wave. Now that you're caught up, I'll continue with what happened to the Johnson family. After the handshake, I introduced myself, explaining my role and the fact that I needed to inspect the house to assess the claim. He nodded politely, though I was certain he already knew why I was there. He introduced himself as Max Johnson, then opened the door and led me inside his impressive home. We stepped into a long hallway with high ceilings. The wallpaper was an ornate forest green design, suiting the rustic charm of the property. The corridor was so long it felt more like a tunnel. The moment I crossed the threshold, I caught the faint smell of burnt wood and paper, just enough to register. You smell it too, don't you? The burning. Yeah, it definitely smells like something was on fire. Over there, see? That's where it started. Max pointed further along the hall, so I walked to where he gestured and saw what he meant. 2 small scorch marks on the wallpaper. I inspected the marks, charred black circles close together. They looked not unlike cigarette burns. It could have been from someone actually stubbing out a cigarette, but I couldn't say for sure. Nor could they prove it wasn't. I turned back to Max. Despite the dim hallway, I could see that behind those shades he wore a look of defeat in his eyes. You'll find 4 more scorch marks further down, 3 more in the kitchen, God knows how many in the bedrooms. His voice was subdued, matching his weary expression. He might have been annoyed, but I still had to do my job. I'd like to speak with your whole family if possible. It helps me get the full picture, I told him politely. Sure, he responded. Not like you'll be here long, I guess. You've seen the scorch marks, and soon enough, you'll see the real damage that thing has done, and then you'll leave. His frustration was evident. He called out for his kids to come downstairs. his voice echoing in the big house. He then motioned me forward, and I followed him along the hallway, noticing more burned patches on the walls. "There's another one," he said without stopping, pointing at another pair of scorch marks. I glanced over, seeing the same blackened circles. Then something else caught my eye. A row of 3 framed family photos. One showed everyone at the beach, another at an amusement park, and the last was a professional portrait. They all shared 2 characteristics. Each photo captured the 5 Johnsons smiling together, and in every single one, their eyes had been burned out. The photo paper around each spot was scorched, though the glass frame was perfectly intact. "It's like that in every picture," Max said over his shoulder. "I'm sure," I replied. He led me through a large doorway at the end of the hall and into a renovated modern kitchen. Across the room stood a long black dining table, around which sat 3 girls. 2 looked about 10 years old, and the eldest was in her mid-teens, as well as a woman in her 40s. Clearly his wife and children. I greeted them, set my briefcase on the table, and pulled out a small recorder. "Is it all right if I ask you all a few questions and record your answers?" They each nodded, somewhat reluctantly, and I started with my initial queries. "Does anyone in the house smoke? Cigarettes, cigars, anything?" All 3 girls shook their heads. Max shot me a glare, and his wife did likewise. "For the record, that's a definite no," I said into the recorder, then continued, "Has anyone conducted any sort of ritual or tried something supernatural? Ouija boards, seances, anything along those lines?" The parents looked at their kids, who all shook their heads. Then the eldest, who I believe was called Grace, spoke up. "No, of course not. In a house this old, we're not about to tempt fate with something like that. I understand, and I apologize if it's a rude question, but it's part of the process. Now, aside from what's already been described, the scorch marks, the burned-out eyes in the photos, and sightings of the flame-eyed man, has anything else strange happened? Any other unexplained incidents?" The entire family offered a general no, except for the middle child, a girl named Jenna, who stayed silent, just staring straight ahead. "So, everyone's certain there have been no other unusual occurrences?" I made eye contact with Jenna as I spoke. She continued to stare, then finally found her voice. I found something in my room." Her tone was shaky and nervous. "What do you mean, honey?" Max asked, concerned. "When that first burn mark appeared on my wall, I noticed something behind the wallpaper. I peeled a bit away, and there was more behind it. It was obvious this was the first time she'd told anyone about it. "What did you see, sweetheart?" Max asked again. "I'll show you." We all stood from the table and followed her out of the kitchen, passing more eyeless family photos along the way. Jenna led us up the wooden stairs to her bedroom, pushing the door open. It looked like a typical girl's room. Pink wallpaper, pink and white striped bedding, a small dollhouse in one corner. However, 5 pairs of circular scorch marks were scattered on the walls, and I noticed one more set burned into the white carpet. Saying nothing, Jenna quietly walked to the dollhouse and nudged it aside, revealing yet another burned spot. But what she truly exposed was a piece of wallpaper she'd peeled away. Behind that torn wallpaper, scrawled right onto the wood, were more scorch marks. But these weren't the same small circles. Instead, the burns formed words. "The friends of the flame call your name. Show us what you have seen." Below those thick, charred letters were additional, smaller names burned into the wood, one after another. Sarah Brown, Sonia Collins, Jack Evans, Daniel Ember. "I've never seen this before," Max muttered, sounding shocked. But I have heard about the Friends of the Flame. And I've heard about Jack Evans, I said, equally taken aback by the discovery. This was my first genuine piece of evidence that the Johnsons' story might be authentic. Yet it was no relief. If anything, it spelled danger for them. Only once before had a claim involving this so-called flame-eyed man resulted in a payout. That was for the late Jack Evans' family after he died. He was found alone in his home, his eyes gouged out, and his empty sockets burned, meaning they burned them after removing the eyes. It was a horrific end, and not one I'd wish on anybody. But I had a growing suspicion that might be the Johnsons' inevitable fate, too. Nonetheless, the words scorched into the wall were enough for me to believe the haunting was real, and enough evidence to justify a payout. Do you mind if I take a photograph of this? It'll greatly improve your chances of receiving compensation, I asked. Max didn't reply, just stared at the wall through his dark glasses, lips moving silently as if repeating the phrase, "Show us what you have seen." His wife, however, nodded in agreement. I reached into my briefcase for a small Polaroid camera, aimed, and took a shot. The camera flashed and whirred, spitting out the developing print. I waved it a bit, watching the image slowly emerge in color. Then I had another idea. Possibly I could secure more irrefutable proof. Do you mind if I take a quick family photo of all of you? It could be important. What for? Max asked warily. Trust me. They exchanged doubtful looks, but eventually huddled together in the middle of the room. No smiles, just fearful eyes. I snapped the picture. The Polaroid spat out a bright flash, reflecting sharply off Max's sunglasses. Then the little photo slid from the camera. It looked normal at first, but as it developed, I saw 10 tiny holes appear, perfectly aligned with each set of eyes in the frame. The color seeped in around those holes, so you could see their faces with empty, burned spaces where their eyes should be. That was all the evidence I needed to confirm the legitimacy of this haunting. Between the writing on the wall and this brand new Polaroid, there was no denying it. Well, I told them, I can confirm this haunting is legitimate and you'll receive the sum you requested. For the briefest moment, Max's exhausted, brooding expression lightened into a faint smile. I just need to assess all the damage around the house to confirm the amount, but I'm pretty sure it'll match your claim. I spent the next few hours documenting each instance of damage, burned walls, destroyed photos, and more. Everything lined up with the Johnsons' story. They would indeed receive the compensation they were seeking. When I finished, I thanked the children for their time and thanked Jenna for showing us what she'd discovered. Max shook my hand. Thanks for coming. Let me walk you out. We went back through the hall, out to the porch. He paused at the top step, then turned to me. There's something I didn't tell you, he said quietly, and I haven't told my wife or kids yet. I studied his face, waiting for him to continue. I've seen the man with the burning eyes again since that night at dinner. I told the guy on the phone I'd only seen him once, but it's been 3 more times now, he said, undoing the top buttons of his shirt. Pulling the fabric aside, he revealed more blistered burns, 2 pairs of small circles on his chest and neck. Then, almost reluctantly, he slid the sunglasses from his face, showing singed skin around his bloodshot eyes. I saw him early this morning. We made eye contact. His voice shook with fear. He showed me things. The second he locked eyes with me and those flames hit, he showed me. He showed me these pits of fire, a ground soaked in blood. I felt the heat, so intense, and heard screaming everywhere. That's all I could hear. He showed me hell. He paused, swallowing hard as if the memory was choking him. I could feel flames licking all over my body, burning me but not killing me. I felt like I was melting, but I wasn't dying. these creatures, demons maybe, or damned souls, gathered around me, laughing, dancing, totally charred and shriveled as if they'd burned for all eternity but still couldn't die. He didn't just show me some vision of hell, though. No, he showed me what's waiting for me. He showed me my future. He trailed off, face pale. I wanted to tear my eyes out just to make it stop. Honest to God, I was wishing he'd burn out my eyes so I wouldn't have to see it anymore. In that moment, I felt real fear for the first time in my entire career. The haunting was genuine. I sensed a desperate urge to leave the house immediately. My heart pounded, and the hairs on my arms stood on end. I could almost feel someone watching me from behind. I had no intention of telling him about Jack Evans and how it ended for him. Perhaps Max Johnson already knew or had guessed what fate might be in store. Maybe he just wanted to secure some money for his family before the inevitable caught up with him. So, I've attached the Polaroids to this report as evidence, and in my professional opinion, this family is truly being terrorized by an evil entity. I recommend we award them the full amount, and fast, before it's too late. In the dense woods near the small rural town of Coyote Springs, Texas, runs a swift creek known to locals as Devil's Fork. For over 80 years, a chilling phenomenon has been witnessed along its banks. A spectral presence that has become woven into the very fabric of local lore. Townsfolk whisper in hushed tones about the Drowned Girl, a name born out of equal measures of fear and reverence by generations of Texans who claim to have seen her. They say the ghost is that of a young girl who met a mysterious fate on the banks of Devil's Fork. Despite the passing years, her appearance remains unnervingly unchanged, as if she had died only yesterday. Witnesses describe her in striking detail, a cascade of fiery red hair that now shimmers with hints of earthy brown under the relentless Texas sun, and hazel eyes that glint almost green when the light catches them just right. She is forever clad in a grimy white dress, its hem long frayed by time, and curiously, she's seen with only one battered boot, the other pale and shoeless, dangling limply in the water. Whenever the local sheriff or a team of Texas Rangers arrives to investigate reports matching her description, she vanishes into thin air, as if dissolving into the humid, stifling atmosphere of a long, sweltering summer night. Some even claim that in the brief moment someone dares to look, her lips twitch ever so slightly, as though in silent acknowledgement, leaving behind an eerie reminder that perhaps her existence is no mere fabrication. The Coyote Springs Police Department is well acquainted with the legend of Devil's Fork. Over decades, numerous patrols have been dispatched whenever tips arose about a body matching the ghostly description. Yet each time, the mysterious figure would vanish before anyone could get close. Some locals dismiss the tale as a product of overactive imaginations in a town too prone to tall tales, while others insist that the consistency of her appearances defies rational explanation. The legend took a darker, more desperate turn one blistering summer when a band of rebellious teenagers, driven by equal parts fear and daredevil curiosity, decided to test the rumors for themselves. My older cousin, Wyatt, surrounded by a rough-and-ready crew of friends from the local high school, led the audacious ritual on a humid late afternoon. I was there too, though still too young to grasp the full weight of what was about to unfold. Wyatt strode up to the edge of Devil's Fork and, with a mix of bravado and trembling determination, seized the ghostly figure's arm as she appeared before us in her usual spot. Without a second thought, he dragged her deeper into the churning water. He pressed her head beneath the icy, muddy current for what felt like an eternity. Even though she had long since been beyond life, it was impossible to tell whether she ever truly submitted to his will. After a couple of minutes, Wyatt hauled her back to the spot where she always reposed and leaned in close, murmuring his desperate request. All he wanted was money, maybe even a new pickup truck, to replace his old, barely running rig that had seen better days. For a hot-headed teenager in a small Texas town, such a wish seemed worth every risk. Then, without warning, Wyatt froze as if he'd heard some ghostly whisper carried on the humid air. None of us could make out a single word, but later, some of the other kids swore they saw the spectral girl's lips quiver, though we were too far away to discern what might have been said. Moments later, Wyatt's face twisted into an eerie grin, more reminiscent of a wild animal than of any expression of satisfaction. "Wyatt?" I asked in a trembling voice. "What's happening?" "Nothing," he snapped back, laughing harshly in a tone that sent shivers down our spines. "Nothing. She's going to give me exactly what I asked for." In the days that followed, several other local youngsters ventured to Devil's Fork to attempt their own rituals, convinced that the ghostly girl held a cursed power capable of granting their most desperate wishes. I, however, kept my distance as those ominous nights passed. In our tight-knit community, rumors spread like wildfire, and soon every hushed conversation spoke of the unholy pact made that fateful afternoon. Wyatt, meanwhile, seemed to be floating on a cloud of reckless ecstasy, as though his wish had already been fulfilled. He began hosting wild parties in the basement of an old, abandoned barn on the outskirts of town. Sneaking bottles of whiskey from his father's hidden stash, he carried himself as though nothing had disturbed the natural order of things. That is, until Uncle Jesse, an old-school Texan with a deep respect for law and order, delivered a stern talking to one humid evening, leaving Wyatt visibly rattled. For us kids, it had all felt like a daring step toward adulthood, though now I realize it was the harbinger of something far more sinister. Roughly 2 weeks after that ill-fated ritual, I noticed a disturbing change in Wyatt. One cool evening, I found him slumped in an old rocking chair on the porch, staring out into the dark woods that bordered Devil's Fork. He looked gaunt, his skin stretched tight like the surface of a worn leather boot, and his eyes bore the mark of a wild, almost animalistic desperation that made my heart pound in terror. When I timidly reached out to him, he recoiled as if I'd touched something unholy. "What's wrong with you?" I asked softly. "Ever since that night, you've been acting crazy." "Crazy?" he retorted sharply. "You don't know a damn thing." Yet behind those words lay a palpable despair, his eyes flickering away from mine as if ashamed of a secret too dark to speak of. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, he murmured, "What I asked for is coming tomorrow." His face broke into an unsettling smile, while his hands trembled violently in the dim light of the porch lamp. Fear and confusion drove me to withdraw into myself, unable to fathom his cryptic warning. I never spoke of that night with anyone. The ritual was to remain a guarded secret, far from the prying eyes of our elders who'd sooner shut us out at the mere mention of Devil's Fork. But the next morning, Uncle Jesse knocked on our door, his face grim as he explained that Wyatt had vanished in the dead of night. He'd slipped out the back after everyone in the house had long since fallen asleep, leaving us with a foreboding sense that something terrible was on the horizon. That very afternoon, as my father drove me through a tangle of amber-hued, rustling pines, we came upon a shocking scene at the bank of Devil's Fork. A somber crowd of young and old had gathered, their expressions etched with a mix of sorrow and disbelief. For a brief moment, I caught sight of Aunt Sarah and Uncle Jesse embracing tightly before my father pulled me aside. "You're not meant to see this," he commanded firmly. Unable to resist, I slipped away and peered over the creek's edge, and what I saw made the blood in my veins run ice cold. Instead of the solitary, spectral figure we'd all come to dread, the water was now choked with the bodies of several teenagers, drifting listlessly among the jagged rocks. There, among them, lay Wyatt, his once bright eyes now empty and soulless. At the center of the grim tableau, the drowned girl floated, her thin, pallid lips curved into a mocking smile, as if she were amused by the tragic consequences of our reckless dare. While the authorities eventually hauled away the lifeless bodies, the ghost remained, unmoved, untouched, as though she had deliberately chosen to linger and watch over the unfolding calamity. The local sheriff's department soon cordoned off the area and posted stern warnings along the winding country roads leading into the woods. Yet, even now, curious children and thrill-seekers managed to sneak into those haunted forests, hoping to catch a glimpse of the spectral girl whose legend refuses to fade. What exactly the drowned girl commanded that fateful night remains a mystery I will likely never unravel. Some say she ordered the teenagers to plunge themselves into the murky water in a fit of vengeful spite. Others whisper that in their desperate bid for the ultimate thrill, they inadvertently sealed their own fate, begging for an escape from lives filled with hardship. I can't help but believe that, for the first time since her untimely demise, the ghostly figure rose up to drag each of those young souls down into the inky depths of Devil's Fork with her own spectral hands. Whether that truly happened is a secret that lingers in the dark shadows of our beloved Texas Creek, a secret I dare not confront by meeting her unblinking eyes. And so, the legend of the drowned girl endures, a grim reminder of a pact with forces beyond our understanding, etched indelibly into the lore of Coyote Springs and the wild, unforgiving heart of Texas. I first came to New Orleans because I needed a change, an escape from the mundane routines that had defined my life for so long. A year ago, I packed what little I owned into my battered old sedan, leaving behind the uniform lawns and identical houses of my home state. New Orleans seemed like the right place to begin anew, a city with a pulse all its own, where history drifts through the streets as tangibly as the Mississippi River itself. When I arrived, it was mid-afternoon, and the sun cast an almost theatrical light on the city's architecture. My new home stood in the heart of the French Quarter, tucked between two more modern-looking buildings. In contrast, the house itself had a worn elegance, boasting wrought iron balconies adorned with curling vines of ivy. The shutters were a faded olive green, peeling at the corners, revealing layers of paint from older eras. One look, and I knew it had stood witness to countless stories, from the time of horse-drawn carriages and gas lanterns to the modern bustle of today's Bourbon Street. Walking along the cobblestone sidewalks for the first time, I felt almost like an intruder stepping into another century. Street performers played saxophones and violins on corners, their music echoing from cracked brick walls. Tourists meandered in colorful clothing, cameras and phones at the ready, marveling at the swirling ferns that dangled over iron railings. A carriage horse clopped by, the driver tipping his hat to passers-by, and always, at every turn, you could smell a mingling of fresh beignets, chicory coffee, and the heavier scents of incense drifting out of voodoo shops. Beneath that veneer of carnival-like vibrancy lay an older, quieter undercurrent, like shadows dancing in the corners of your vision. It was in the hush of an alleyway, in the flicker of a street lamp at dusk, or in the whispering hush of oak trees draped with Spanish moss in the nearby garden district. I felt it the moment I stepped out of my car. This was a city not quite like any other, a place unafraid to blend the mundane with the mystical. My landlady, Mrs. Maribel Dupreau, was waiting at the entrance, leaning lightly on a carved walking cane. She was a petite woman, well into her 70s, with silver hair pinned in a tight bun, giving her an air of old-world grace. She greeted me with a polite but restrained smile. "I'm pleased you made it safely," she said, her soft Louisiana accent smoothing the words. "We don't get many long-term renters in this part of the quarter, especially young students." She handed over a single key on a wrought iron keychain shaped like a fleur-de-lis. "That key is 100 years old at least," she informed me. "Keep it safe. Locks in this house like to stay loyal to the original hardware." As we ventured into the townhouse's interior, a hush seemed to fall. The corridor stretched ahead, the walls lined with faded wallpaper patterned with climbing vines. Wooden floors creaked beneath every step. One corner of the hall was occupied by an antique chair, its upholstery worn to threads. Everything smelled faintly musty, like old books and memories left to rest in darkened rooms. "This house has old bones," Mrs. Dupree commented, tapping the wall gently with her cane. "Old memories, too. If you ever feel uneasy, just talk to it. Let it know you're here in peace." She gave a half laugh, as if it was a joke, but her eyes remained serious. I offered a small smile in return, unsure how to respond. I'd heard rumors of New Orleans' haunted reputation. People spoke of ghosts like they were as common as the city's summer thunderstorms. But I told myself these tales were mostly tourist fodder. Little did I know, of course, just how literal her warning was. My new apartment occupied the second floor. Sunlight filtered through tall windows at odd angles, casting pale bars of light on the hardwood floor. I found the living room cozy, if outdated. A large fireplace with an ornate mantel, built-in shelves, and a chandelier drooping from the ceiling. The mantel displayed a few old figurines, a porcelain cat, a small angel, left behind by previous tenants or possibly by the original owners. The place emanated a sense of weighty history that both intrigued and unsettled me. I arranged my few belongings, stacking books on the dusty shelves and placing bright throw pillows on the couch in an attempt to bring color to the gloomy interior. Chili, my black and white cat who had traveled with me, sniffed around curiously, tail fluffed with apprehension. He prowled from room to room, pausing at closed doors as though expecting someone to open them from the other side. Despite the house's dark corners, I was eager to start this new chapter. My master's program in history, with a specialization in Southern folklore, was set to begin at a local university just outside the quarter. I spent the first few weeks attending orientation sessions, meeting professors, and forging friendships with classmates who hailed from all over the country. We bonded over coffee and late-night study groups, often venturing into the quarter afterward to soak up the lively bars or just wander down quiet streets under old lanterns. Little by little, I learned the rhythms of the city. I discovered that the faint sound of distant saxophone music often lulled me to sleep, and that the thick Louisiana humidity could make even the simplest daytime errands feel like wading through warm water. I found a favorite cafe near Jackson Square, where the baristas drew little designs in my latte foam, and a fruit stand that sold the sweetest peaches I had ever tasted. It felt like I was slipping into an alternate universe, somewhere both enthralling and dangerously enchanting. For a time, nothing particularly alarming happened within my new home. I caught glimpses of flickering shadows in the corner of my eye, or sometimes heard footsteps on the stairs when Chili was curled at my feet. But I chalked these up to the house's age. Old wood and old pipes, I reasoned, could create all sorts of illusions. Besides, I'd experienced small supernatural quirks all my life, like lamps that switched themselves off, or doors that sometimes opened if I stared at them too long. I had grown used to brushing these things aside. But then came the first undeniable sign. my favorite turquoise hairbrush disappeared from the bathroom counter. I combed the entire apartment, under sofas, behind doors, even inside the fridge, just to be absolutely sure. No luck. 3 days later, it reappeared in the exact spot I remembered leaving it. Not dusty or out of place, just there, mockingly mundane. I tried not to dwell on it. I was juggling coursework deadlines and social gatherings, so maybe my memory was just playing tricks on me. Yet a part of me couldn't ignore the chill that came whenever I glanced at that hairbrush, as though it had been somewhere beyond my sight, and then decided to return. My friend Madison, a literature major with an obsession for Gothic novels, soon became a regular visitor. She had an adventurous spirit and a fascination with anything eerie, so she was naturally drawn to my old Creole townhouse. One cool Friday evening, I invited her for dinner. We picked up takeout from a nearby gumbo shop and ate in the living room by the soft glow of 2 antique lamps. The walls seemed to hold their breath, listening in on our conversation. At one point, Madison excused herself to the bathroom. When she returned, she wore a puzzled expression. "You're a neat freak, huh?" she teased. I blinked, genuinely confused, as she led me to the bathroom. Every bottle, every tube, lotion, shampoo, soap dispensers had been lined up in an impossibly straight row, precisely equidistant. I stood there, heart pounding. I certainly hadn't arranged them that way, and Madison looked too genuinely startled to be pulling a prank. An uneasy hush settled over us. Madison broke the silence with a nervous laugh. "Well," she said, trying to lighten the mood, "at least if the house is haunted, it's tidy." I forced a grin, but the incident clawed at my thoughts long after she left. Over the next few weeks, life became a balancing act. By day, I was buried in research papers and group projects, immersing myself in the labyrinthine archives of Louisiana history. By night, small disturbances at home multiplied. Flickers of light in the halls, faint whispers from the attic, or the sensation of being watched as I walked from one room to another. Chilly began spending more time under the bed, occasionally staring at nothing with widened eyes. One Saturday morning, I awoke early, intending to enjoy a lazy brunch in the kitchen. Instead, I found an arrangement of silverware on my table. Forks, knives, spoons, all placed in a perfect circle with their handles pointing inward. It was so precise, so meticulous, that it sent a jolt of unease through me. It felt almost like a ritual symbol, though I couldn't decipher its meaning. My hands trembled as I hastily gathered the utensils, scattering them in the sink. If some entity was leaving me messages, I wanted no part of it. Still, I tried to maintain a sense of normalcy. I threw myself into my studies, stayed late at the university library, and joined a small research group exploring Louisiana's Creole culture. We took field trips to old plantations along the river, took notes on Creole architecture, and interviewed local historians who seemed to have a story for every century. My fascination with the city's past deepened, yet a part of me recognized I was living on the edge of something distinctly supernatural. Each day, I wondered if I was inviting more activity by studying the city's haunted history. One of the most jarring incidents occurred after I spent an entire day at the library, poring over archival documents. I returned home well past sunset. The quarter was lively. Tourists snapping photos of costumed street performers, a brass band marching by, the smell of fried foods wafting from open windows. Inside my townhouse, I was greeted by an unsettling sight. The living room was in disarray. An antique armoire, which had been closed and locked since I moved in, stood wide open. Cans of soup, boxes of cereal, bags of rice, all my pantry staples, were stacked in a precarious tower inside it, nearly reaching the top shelf. Chairs had been pushed together in bizarre formations, pillows tossed in corners, and a single dining chair balanced on top of the tower like a crowning piece. It looked like some twisted art installation. Chili was crouched in the corner, eyes darting around the room as if following invisible movements. My heart hammered in my chest. I dropped my backpack on the floor and frantically checked for signs of forced entry. Nothing. Windows and doors were locked as I had left them. Only my key could open the front door, and I had it with me all day. The sense of violation ran deep. For hours, I reorganized everything, replacing cans in the kitchen and returning furniture to its rightful place. The entire time, I felt eyes upon me, as though the house was silently laughing at my efforts. More than once, I glanced over my shoulder, certain I'd see someone lurking in the shadows. But the rooms were empty, just me, Chili, and the echo of my own ragged breathing. On a sweltering evening soon after, I awoke in the middle of the night to a faint scraping sound from downstairs. My first thought was to check on Chili, who, by then, had a habit of disappearing when the disturbances flared up. Morning found me slumped on the living room sofa, half-dressed and exhausted from a near sleepless night. As I trudged into the kitchen, I froze. Chili lay in a puddle of bright red liquid that shimmered in the early daylight. My mind immediately jumped to the worst conclusion: blood. Panic surged through me, heart pounding so loudly I could barely think. But when I knelt down, gingerly pressing a hand against Chili's fur, I realized it was ketchup. A glance at my refrigerator confirmed the nearly empty bottle, its lid discarded casually on the counter. Chili, trembling but unharmed, looked up at me with wide, frightened eyes. A wave of anger overwhelmed my initial relief. Up until then, the entity's pranks, while unsettling, had been directed at objects and furniture. Now, it had escalated to targeting a living creature, my cat. It felt personal, a violation of a boundary I hadn't realized I'd set. I cleaned Chili in the sink, gently talking to her in a soothing voice. Then, still drenched in dread, I whispered to the house, "Enough. Stop this, or if you must haunt someone, haunt me, but leave my cat alone." I adopted a new nightly routine, locking Chili in my bedroom with me, sprinkling a bit of salt at the thresholds, an old folk remedy I read about, and leaving a dim lamp on. The nights became a haunted vigil, with distant scraping noises echoing in the attic, and doors opening on their own with groans of protest. Sleep was scarce. My class performance began to slip. Friends noticed the dark circles under my eyes, but I offered excuses. Long study sessions, stress, allergies, anything but the truth. I wasn't ready for people to think I was losing my mind. Then came the morning I discovered the word "stay" scrawled across the bathroom mirror, on the tiles, and even on the porcelain tub. Soap, shampoo, and toothpaste formed a ghostly chorus of letters. The message left me shaking. Whoever or whatever was behind these disturbances had grown bolder, more purposeful, and it was issuing demands now. Struggling to maintain composure, I stumbled into the kitchen, only to find my largest knife standing upright on the table, gleaming under the overhead light. A family photo that I'd brought from my childhood home, my parents and me smiling at a picnic, had been pinned to the wall with the tip of that knife, the rest of it ripped away so that only my face remained intact. My parents' images were shredded. That was the moment the true horror sank in. This was no longer a few ghostly pranks. It was a targeted attack by a presence intent on dominating not just the space, but me. My sense of safety, my cherished memories, my beloved pet. Everything was a piece on its stage of fear. Desperate, exhausted, and terrified, I remembered the cautionary tales my classmates had shared about vengeful spirits in old Creole homes. Some recommended local mediums, others joked nervously about exorcists. My friend Madison had mentioned a voodoo practitioner, Madame Solange, renowned among students and locals alike. People whispered that her family lineage traced back to one of the earliest Creole matriarchs, granting her unique insight into spirits that roamed these parts. Her shop was tucked away on a quiet side street near Jackson Square. From the outside, it appeared unassuming, a small sign reading, Madame Solange's Remedies and Charms. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of burning sage and myrrh, the shelves lined with jars of dried herbs, powders, and colored candles. The walls were draped in embroidered cloths depicting symbols I didn't recognize. Madame Solange herself was seated behind a wooden counter, her braided hair threaded with small charms and beads. She regarded me with calm, knowing eyes, nodding as though she'd expected my arrival. Leading me behind a velvet curtain, she listened intently to my story without the slightest hint of skepticism. "Your house," she said in a measured tone, "has awoken something old. Sometimes these spirits attach themselves to the land or to the objects within it. Other times, they respond to a person, especially someone with a natural sensitivity to the unseen." She recommended a cleansing ritual, burning specific herbs in every room, reciting prayers in both French and English to respect the city's layered spiritual heritage, and leaving an offering, traditionally a small bowl of sweetened water or rum, meant to appease the restless dead. She also advised me to set firm boundaries. "They must know you will not submit," she said. "But be warned, some entities do not part easily from the places they've claimed." I returned home with sage bundles, a carved white candle, and a small vial of protective oil. The moment I stepped inside, an almost electric tension greeted me, as though the house recognized my new resolve. Chili meowed uneasily from the sofa, her green eyes following something I couldn't see. I lit the sage and began walking through each room, smudging the corners where energy often collects. "You do not belong here," I whispered, my voice trembling but firm. "This is my home now. Whatever unrest you feel, be at peace. I offer you release." I repeated variations of these words, remembering to speak them in French when I could, mindful of the city's Creole roots. The smoke spiraled upwards, clinging to the rafters and swirling in pockets of stale air. In the kitchen, I placed the carved white candle in a small dish of salt and lit it. The flame shimmered, illuminating the old cabinets and worn countertops. Then I left a bowl of sweetened rum, saying, "Take this as a sign of my respect. May we find harmony, or may we part ways." For a brief moment I felt the pressure in the air lessen, as though something had stepped back. But soon after, I heard a heavy thud in the living room. Rushing in, I found one of the armchairs tipped on its side, the cushion yanked out and tossed a few feet away. It felt like a defiant gesture, yet the atmosphere had shifted. The aggression, while present, seemed less suffocating, more uncertain. I spent the rest of the evening repeating prayers and relighting the sage whenever it burned low. Over the next few days, the activity ebbed and flowed. Sometimes I'd find objects rearranged again. Books stacked in odd patterns, drawers yanked open. Other times, the house felt almost peaceful, the new hush feeling like a tenuous truce. Late one night, I heard faint music, distant and tinny, like an old record player spinning a jazz tune from decades past. But it stopped abruptly whenever I tried to trace the source. Then came a violent outburst that shattered my fragile sense of progress. In the early hours of a Monday morning, a thunderstorm rolled in, rattling windows with gusts of wind and sheets of rain. I woke to a deafening crash in the hallway. My bedroom door flew open so hard it banged into the wall, the handle leaving a dent. In the flickering lightning, I saw a shapeless shadow flicker across the ceiling, vanishing as quickly as it appeared. Downstairs, I discovered the living room in chaos. Books flung from shelves, the coffee table overturned, and a spiderweb of cracks in the mirror above the fireplace. Chilly cowered behind the sofa, pupils dilated with terror. My heart thundered in my ears as I realized that the entity had not been banished at all. It was fighting back with renewed force. At my wit's end, I called Madison, begging her to come over despite the storm. She arrived drenched, clutching a thick old tome borrowed from the university library. The book, she explained, contained accounts of local Creole rituals and exorcisms carried out in the city's earlier days. Many of them involved a combination of Catholic prayers and African spiritual elements, reflecting the diverse heritage of New Orleans. By candlelight, the two of us began reciting passages, stumbling over archaic French phrases. Outside, lightning illuminated the French Quarter, revealing narrow streets slick with rain and the silhouettes of iron balconies. Inside, every flash exposed the ravaged state of my living room, as though we were in the aftermath of a violent invasion. At one point, as we chanted in unison, the entire house seemed to vibrate. A thunderous crack reverberated through the walls, and the chandelier overhead swung wildly. For a moment, I feared the ceiling would cave in, but then, as quickly as it had begun, the tremors subsided. The candle's flames steadied, no longer dancing like they were caught in a wind tunnel. We waited, breath caught in our throats, expecting another surge of destruction. Yet a profound silence fell. Minutes passed, 10, then 20, with no further disturbances. Madison lowered the book, tears of relief shining in her eyes. I sat down, barely managing to keep from collapsing. The storm outside began to ease, and the tension within the house seemed to ebb with it. In the days that followed, life took on a cautious equilibrium. The house remained old and creaky, occasionally producing strange noises in the night, but the overtly hostile manifestations diminished. Chilly emerged from her hiding places more often, though she stayed vigilant, ears perked at the slightest sound. A few times, I still felt a flicker of unease in certain corners, especially the attic, which I'd begun locking from the outside, but nothing as terrifying as before. I visited Madame Solange to thank her and to update her on the situation. She nodded knowingly, reminding me that some entities simply retreat, waiting for the right moment to stir again. Keep practicing your protections, she advised. Show respect, but do not show fear. Fear is the doorway through which they gain strength. Life in New Orleans carried on. The city's calendar of festivals kept everyone buzzing with excitement. Costumed parades filled the streets, brass bands blared at all hours, and spontaneous parties erupted on balconies draped with beads and ribbons. Mardi Gras season arrived in a riot of color and celebration. People danced in the streets under a shower of confetti, sipping daiquiris and cheering as float after float rolled by. For a time, the revelry seemed to chase away the lingering shadows in my life. Still, every so often, I felt the subtle echo of the house's old energy. It was in the hush that descended after midnight, or in the flicker of a candle casting a silhouette that shouldn't quite be there. A soft scraping in the attic. An odd whisper, half heard, as I passed the living room. Each time, I remembered the warnings. Some things lie dormant rather than disappearing entirely. Madison remained a constant support, and we even organized a small study group dedicated to paranormal history. Our goal was to explore how legends had shaped Louisiana's cultural identity. We uncovered tales of restless spirits from antebellum plantations, cryptic sightings in the bayous, And, of course, countless ghost stories from the city's past, the Myrtles plantation, the LaLaurie mansion, and many other infamous locations. With each new discovery, I felt a chill of recognition. I was living in one of those stories, albeit one not yet recorded in any historical archive. These days, the townhouse has fallen into a quieter routine. I still burn sage once a month, walking the halls and corners with whispered prayers. I keep protective talismans near the windows and doorways, small amulets blessed by Madame Solange or found at local voodoo shops. Chilly, more comfortable than ever, stretches out in warm patches of sunlight without trembling at every sound. In quieter moments, though, I can't forget what happened. When the wind rattles the shutters late at night, I remember the time my living room was turned upside down by an invisible force. When I set a jar of salt on the kitchen counter, I recall the circle of silverware, arranged like some arcane symbol. The memory of Chili lying in a pool of ketchup, trembling in fear, is impossible to erase. From the outside, my life probably looks normal. I attend classes, write papers, meet friends for coffee, and occasionally join the crowds on Bourbon Street to listen to jazz or sample local cuisine. Yet beneath that ordinary facade, I've gained a profound awareness of how thin the veil between the seen and the unseen can be, especially in a place like New Orleans, where history and spirit coexist as naturally as air and breath. New Orleans is a tapestry woven from the threads of countless cultures: French, Spanish, African, Caribbean, and American, all mingling in the humid air. It's a place where the boundaries between the living and the dead seem more porous than elsewhere. Ghost tours file down the streets nightly, their guides spinning tales of tragic brides and phantom children, of old voodoo queens still roaming the alleys. I sometimes hear the hushed awe of tourists as they pass my townhouse, the guide pointing out old structures rumored to be haunted. They speak of restless spirits as though they're as common as street musicians, and in this city, maybe they are. I've learned to coexist with whatever lingers here. I speak gently to the house sometimes, like one might to a pet or a skittish roommate. I tell it when I'm leaving for the day, and I announce my return at night. There's a sense that the walls are listening, that they're old enough and alive enough to hold a grudge if I don't show proper respect. I keep fresh flowers on the fireplace mantel, an unspoken offering to any presence that might appreciate the gesture. Though I've regained a semblance of peace, I can't pretend the ordeal left me unscarred. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of a dying light bulb might trigger a small surge of anxiety. I suspect that, on some level, the house has claimed a part of me, just as I've claimed it by choosing to remain. Some nights, when the city's revelry has quieted and a hush blankets the quarter, I listen for footsteps on the stairs. I linger in the living room, half expecting the furniture to tremble or rearrange itself once again. But for now, all is still. Perhaps the spirits have returned to their slumber, or perhaps they merely watch from the corners, waiting. Either way, I've learned that in New Orleans, a city radiant with jazz and haunted by its own legends. The line between ordinary life and the supernatural is as thin as a thread of Spanish moss. Here, in this old Creole townhouse, I continue my life, mindful of the secrets hidden in walls, respectful of the energies that share my space. And so, I remain, a wary tenant in a haunted home, buoyed by the vibrancy of the city I've come to love, ever watchful for the moment when the shadows might stir again.